in the mists of time, where ancient stones still whisper secrets of forgotten kings, there lies an island wrapped in legend and shrouded in the smoke of 1,000 battles. Here, beneath grey skies that have watched empires rise and fall like morning fog, the very soil remembers the footsteps of conquerors and the tears of the conquered. This is England in her medieval glory, a tapestry woven from Norman steel and Saxon blood, from the prayers of monks and the oaths of knights, from the dreams of peasants and the ambitions of kings. Listen now, as the centuries unfold like pages, in an illuminated manuscript, each chapter telling of triumph and tragedy, of castles built on hope and kingdoms lost to time. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. The year 1066 dawned cold and grey over England, as if the very heavens sensed the approaching storm that would reshape a nation forever. Edward the Confessor, that pious king who had ruled for 24 years with the gentle hand of a monk rather than the iron fist of a warrior, lay dying in his great palace at Westminster. Around his deathbed gathered the most powerful men in the realm, their faces etched with concern not merely for their dying sovereign, but for the succession crisis that his passing would inevitably unleash. For Edward had left no heir of his own body, and in the dangerous game of medieval kingship, an empty throne was like a beacon fire calling every ambitious noble from across the known world. The king's chamber, lit by flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on tapestried walls, became the stage for whispered conversations that would echo through the centuries. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, stood closest to the royal bed, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he watched the rise and fall of the king's laboured breathing. Harold was a man shaped by the harsh realities of his time, tall and broad-shouldered, with the calloused hands of a warrior and eyes that had seen too many battlefields. As Earl of Wessex, he commanded the loyalty of much of southern England, and his sister Edith had been Edward's queen, though their marriage had remained childless, bound more by political necessity than passion. When Edward's dying whisper named Harold as his successor, it seemed the natural choice. Yet those present knew that other claimants across the narrow sea would not accept this decision without a fight. Within hours of Edward's death on January 5th, 1066, Harold was crowned king in Westminster Abbey, that magnificent church Edward himself had built as his great monument. The ceremony was conducted with unseemly haste, as if speed alone could legitimize what many would consider a questionable claim. Yet Harold had little choice but to act swiftly, for winter's grip on the land would soon loosen, and with spring would come the ships of his enemies. Across the channel in Normandy, William the Bastard, as he was still known to his enemies, received news of Harold's coronation with cold fury. In his great castle at Rouen, surrounded by the tapestries and treasures that marked him as one of the wealthiest princes in Christendom, William declared that Harold had broken a sacred oath. Years earlier, when Harold had been shipwrecked on the Norman coast, William claimed the English earl had sworn on holy relics to support his claim to the English throne. Whether this oath had been freely given or extracted under duress mattered little now. William had papal backing for his cause and the righteous anger of a man who believed himself wronged. The Norman Duke was a formidable figure, already in his late 30s and tempered by years of warfare that had forged him into one of Europe's most capable military commanders. His duchy, though smaller than England, was rich and well organized, its knights trained in the new style of heavy cavalry that had revolutionized European warfare. More importantly, William possessed something Harold lacked: the patient cunning to turn this crisis into an opportunity for lasting conquest rather than mere revenge. Throughout the spring and summer of 1066, Harold Godwinson watched the horizons of his kingdom with the anxious eyes of a shepherd who knows wolves circle his flock. From the north came disturbing reports that Harald Hardrada, the mighty king of Norway, was also pressing his claim to the English throne, basing his right on ancient treaties between Magnus of Norway and Harthacnut, the the last Danish king of England. Hardrada was a legend in his own lifetime, a giant of a man who had served in the elite Varangian Guard of Byzantium and fought battles from the fjords of Norway to the golden palaces of Constantinople. But it was from the south that Harold expected the greatest threat. Throughout the summer months, reports reached his court of the vast preparations underway in Normandy. William was not merely gathering an army, he was orchestrating one of the most ambitious military expeditions of the medieval age. From every corner of France came knights eager to join his cause, drawn by promises of English lands and Norman gold. Shipwrights worked day and night in Norman ports, constructing a fleet capable of carrying not just warriors, but their precious war horses across the treacherous waters of the Channel. The English king's strategy was necessarily defensive. He positioned his fleet along the southern coast and called up the Fyrd, the traditional English militia system that required every free man to serve in defence of the realm. Through the long summer months, these English warriors waited, watching the grey waters of the Channel for the dark shapes of Norman sails. The coastal communities of Kent and Sussex lived in a state of constant tension, their fields worked by men who kept weapons close at hand, and their women ready to flee inland at the first sign of invasion. As autumn approached and the Norman invasion failed to materialize, Harold faced a cruel choice. The Fyrd could not be maintained indefinitely. These men were farmers and craftsmen whose presence was needed for the harvest that would feed England through the coming winter. On September 8, with heavy heart, Harold dismissed the militia and allowed his fleet to return to London for refitting. It seemed that William had missed his chance, for the autumn storms that began to lash the Channel would make any crossing a perilous gamble. Yet even as Harold breathed easier, fate was preparing to test his kingdom with trials beyond his worst imaginings. Word reached him that Harald Hardrada had at last made his move, landing in the north with a vast Norwegian fleet that blackened the waters of the Humber. The Viking king had allied himself with Tostig, Harold's own exiled brother, creating a northern threat that could not be ignored. The irony was bitter. Just as the southern danger seemed to recede, the northern storm broke with devastating force. Harold Godwinson's response to the northern invasion demonstrated the qualities that had made him the most respected military commander of his generation. Gathering his household troops and what remained of his standing forces, he marched north at a pace that astounded his contemporaries, covering the distance from London to Yorkshire in just 4 days. This was warfare conducted at the speed of desperation, with the very survival of the kingdom hanging in the balance. At Stamford Bridge, on September 25, 1066, the two armies met in what would prove to be the last great victory of Anglo-Saxon England. The Norwegian host, confident after their recent triumph at Fulford Gate, had allowed themselves to be caught unprepared, many without armour in the warm autumn sun. Harald Hardrada, the last of the great Viking warrior kings, fell early. In the battle, his death sending shockwaves through the Norwegian ranks, Tostig, Harold's brother turned traitor, died beside his Norwegian ally, ending a fraternal rivalry that had divided England. The English victory was complete and crushing. Of the 300 ships that had brought the Norwegian army to England, barely 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. Yet even as Harold savoured this triumph, riders were spurring their horses southward with news that would transform victory into prelude to disaster. William of Normandy had at last crossed the Channel, landing at Pevensey on September 28th, just 3 days after Stamford Bridge. The Norman invasion had been timed with the calculating precision that marked all of William's military endeavours. Taking advantage of favourable winds and Harold's absence in the north, the Norman fleet had crossed under cover of darkness, their ships guided by experienced mariners who knew these waters well. The landing itself was unopposed, the southern coast stripped of defenders by Harold's northern campaign. William established his base at Hastings, fortifying the position while his foraging parties spread across the Sussex countryside, living off the land and terrorising the local population. When news of the Norman landing reached Harold at York, the English king faced perhaps the most difficult decision of his reign. His army was exhausted from their northern victory, many of his best warriors wounded or killed at Stamford Bridge. The sensible course would have been to remain in York, gathering reinforcements and allowing his forces to recover their strength. Yet Harold understood that every day's delay would strengthen William's position and increase the suffering of his southern subjects. Against the advice of his wisest counsellors, Harold chose to march south immediately. It was a decision born of courage and desperation in equal measure. The choice of a king who valued the welfare of his people above his own strategic advantage. The march south was a race against time, conducted through October's shortened days. As the first winter frosts began to silver the English countryside, Harold paused only briefly in London, gathering what additional forces he could muster before continuing toward the fateful meeting that awaited him on the Sussex Downs. On the morning of October 14th, 1066, two armies faced each other across the battlefield that would determine the fate of England for centuries to come. The English force, perhaps 8,000 strong, held the crest of Senlac Hill in the traditional defensive formation that had served Anglo-Saxon warriors for generations. The shield wall stretched across the hilltop, a living barrier of interlocked shields and gleaming spear points, behind which stood the flower of English nobility and the battle-hardened veterans of Stamford Bridge. Harold himself stood in the centre of the line, beneath the dragon banner of Wessex and his personal standard of the fighting man. Around him clustered his housecarls, professional warriors whose two-handed Danish axes had been the terror of Viking raiders for decades. These men had followed Harold through countless campaigns, and their loyalty to their king was absolute. They knew, as did every man in that grim line, that this day would see either the preservation of Anglo-Saxon England or its final transformation into something entirely new. Below them on the slope, William's army prepared for assault with the methodical precision that marked Norman military practice. The Normans had brought to England a new style of warfare, one that combined heavy cavalry, disciplined infantry, and, most crucially, trained archers in unprecedented numbers. William's force was truly international, drawing fighters from across France and beyond, all united under the papal banner that proclaimed this a holy war sanctioned by God himself. The battle opened with a devastating arrow storm, as hundreds of Norman bowmen sent volley after volley into the English ranks. The sky darkened with shafts, and the sound was like that of a great wind rustling through leaves, except that this wind brought death. The English shields absorbed much of the barrage, but men began to fall, and gaps appeared in what had seemed an impregnable wall. Yet still the English held, their discipline unbroken despite the growing casualties. Then came the cavalry charges, wave after wave of Norman knights thundering up the slope with lances levelled and war cries echoing across the battlefield. The English line bent, but did not break, the housecarls' great axes taking a terrible toll on horses and riders alike. Time and again the Norman cavalry recoiled from that bristling wall of steel, leaving the slope littered with the fallen. For hours the battle raged, neither side able to gain decisive advantage, while the October sun traced its arc across a sky grown grey with smoke and dust. The turning point came late in the day, when a rumour spread through the Norman ranks that William himself had fallen. Panic began to spread until the Duke, removing his helmet to show his face, rallied his men with the force of his presence. It was then that William employed the tactical masterstroke that would decide the battle. Ordering a feigned retreat, he drew the English from their strong position on the hilltop, breaking the discipline that had held the shield wall intact through hours of assault. As portions of the English army pursued what they believed to be fleeing Normans, William's cavalry wheeled and struck at the disordered pursuers. The shield wall, once broken, could not be reformed under the pressure of renewed assault. The English line began to collapse, section by section, as Norman knights exploited every gap and weakness. Harold himself fell in the final assault, struck down beneath his banners as the last of his housecarls died around him in a final futile gesture of loyalty. With the death of the king, English resistance crumbled. The survivors of that terrible day scattered across the darkening battlefield, leaving behind the bodies of their king and the flower of Anglo-Saxon nobility. William of Normandy, bloodied but victorious, stood amid the carnage as the sun set, on one age of English history and rose on another. The conquest was complete, though its consequences would unfold over generations. In the aftermath of Hastings, William faced the challenge that had broken lesser conquerors throughout history, transforming military victory into lasting political control. The Norman Duke understood that defeating Harold's army was merely the first step in a campaign that would require years to complete. England was not simply to be plundered and abandoned, as Viking raiders had done for centuries, but rather to be absorbed, controlled, and fundamentally transformed according to Norman vision and Norman law. The march on London began immediately, but William's route was deliberately circuitous, a calculated display of power designed to break English morale. His army swept through Kent and Surrey, capturing Dover and its vital port, then circling north and west to approach the capital from multiple directions. Each town that submitted was spared. Those that resisted were burned. The message was clear. Accommodation would be rewarded, defiance would be crushed without mercy. London's resistance collapsed without a siege. The remaining English nobles, led by Archbishop Stigand and the young Edgar Atheling, the last scion of the old royal house, met William at Berkhamsted to offer their submission. It was a moment pregnant with historical significance, the formal transfer of a kingdom from one dynasty to another, yet conducted with the mundane ceremony of medieval politics. Edgar's claim to the throne was better than William's in terms of blood, but the boy lacked both army and allies, his cause dying with Harold on the field of Hastings. On Christmas Day 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, the same church where Harold had received his crown nearly 11 months earlier. The ceremony blended Norman ambition with English tradition, as William sought to legitimize his rule by adopting some of the forms and customs of his predecessor. Yet the very stones of the abbey seemed to protest this transformation, for outside the church, William's soldiers mistook the ceremonial shouts of acclamation for signs of rebellion and began burning houses in the surrounding streets. The early years of Norman rule were marked by a series of revolts that tested William's resolve and revealed the iron beneath his diplomatic facade. The most serious uprising occurred in 1069 to 1070, when a coalition of English nobles invited Danish intervention, hoping to restore the old order with foreign assistance. The rebellion spread across the north, with York changing hands multiple times and English guerrilla bands operating from the fenlands of East Anglia under leaders like Hereward the Wake. William's response was devastating in its completeness. The harrying of the north, conducted during the winter of 1069-1070, was systematic destruction on a scale that shocked even medieval chroniclers accustomed to warfare's brutalities. From York to Durham, the Norman armies burned villages, slaughtered livestock, and destroyed the tools and seed corn that would have enabled recovery. Contemporary sources describe the land as remaining desolate for generations, with refugees streaming south to escape starvation in what had once been England's most prosperous region. By 1071, English resistance had been effectively crushed, but William understood that military conquest alone would not suffice. The Norman king embarked upon a systematic transformation of English society, replacing not merely the ruling class, but the very structures of governance, law, and culture that had defined Anglo-Saxon England. The Great Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, stands as monument to this transformation, a comprehensive survey of English wealth and property that enabled William to redistribute the land of England among his Norman followers with bureaucratic precision. The most visible symbol of Norman domination was the castle, that revolutionary innovation in military architecture that transformed the English landscape forever. Unlike the great communal halls where Anglo-Saxon nobles had held court, surrounded by their warriors in bonds of mutual obligation, the Norman castle was designed for a different purpose entirely: the projection of power by a small elite over a potentially hostile population. These fortifications rose like stone growths from English soil, each one a statement of permanent conquest and foreign rule. The earliest Norman castles were simple affairs: motte and bailey constructions that could be erected quickly to establish control over key strategic points. A wooden tower topped an artificial mound surrounded by a palisaded courtyard where horses, supplies, and retainers could be sheltered during times of danger. Yet even these humble beginnings represented a revolution in the relationship between ruler and ruled, for these were not communal strongholds, but private fortresses, designed to protect the Norman garrison against the very people they had come to govern. As Norman rule solidified, these temporary structures gave way to massive stone edifices that still dominate the English countryside today. The Tower of London, begun during William's reign, exemplified this new architecture of power. Its white tower, rising 90 feet above the Thames, was designed not merely as a fortress, but as a statement of Norman permanence, its Norman Romanesque architecture as foreign to English eyes as the French voices that echoed within its walls. The transformation extended far beyond mere military architecture. Norman administrative practices, imported wholesale from the efficient bureaucracy that William had developed in Normandy itself, replaced the more informal governance structures of Anglo-Saxon England. The King's Court became a cosmopolitan centre where French was spoken as naturally as English, where continental customs gradually displaced native traditions, and where preferment depended not on ancient bloodlines, but on service to the new Norman state. Perhaps most significantly, the Norman Conquest transformed the English Church, that institution which had been the repository of Anglo-Saxon learning and culture for centuries. Archbishop Stigand was deposed and replaced by Lanfranc, a scholar administrator who had been abbot of Bec in Normandy. Under Lanfranc's direction, the English Church was reformed according to continental models, its ancient liturgies replaced by Norman practices, its Anglo-Saxon bishops systematically replaced by Norman and other foreign appointees. The cultural implications of this ecclesiastical transformation cannot be overstated. In an age when the Church was virtually the sole repository of literacy and learning, the replacement of English churchmen with Norman ones meant that the very language of education and administration would shift from English to Latin and French. Anglo-Saxon literary traditions, which had produced masterpieces like Beowulf and the sophisticated historical chronicles of the pre-conquest period, were abandoned in favour of continental models that reflected Norman tastes and Norman values. Yet, William's genius lay not in wholesale replacement, but in selective adaptation. The new king retained many Anglo-Saxon governmental institutions that had proven their effectiveness over centuries of development. The English system of shires and hundreds, the efficient tax collection mechanisms, and the sophisticated legal procedures that had made pre-conquest England one of Europe's most effectively governed kingdoms were preserved and improved rather than abandoned. This pragmatic approach helped ensure that the Norman conquest would prove lasting in ways that previous invasions had not. The Norman conquest introduced to England a social system that would define the kingdom's structure for centuries to come. Feudalism, that complex web of personal relationships, land tenure, and military obligation that had evolved in post-Carolingian France. Under this system, all land ultimately belonged to the king, who granted portions of it to his most trusted followers. In exchange for military service and personal loyalty, these great lords, or tenants-in-chief, in turn subdivided their holdings among lesser nobles, creating a pyramid of obligation that theoretically bound every person in the kingdom to every other through chains of mutual dependence. At the apex of this system sat William himself, no longer merely Duke of Normandy, but King of England, commanding resources that made him one of the most powerful rulers in Christendom. The English crown lands, vastly expanded through the confiscation of Anglo-Saxon estates, provided him with wealth that dwarfed his Norman revenues. More importantly, the systematic nature of the conquest meant that every acre of English soil was now held by his explicit grant, making the theoretical foundations of feudal tenure practical reality in ways they had never been even in France. The great Norman lords who received the largest shares of this redistributed wealth were carefully chosen for their loyalty and competence. Men like William Fitz-Osbern, who received the crucial Marcher lordship of Chepstow, and Hugh d'Avaranches, who became Earl of Chester, were not merely military commanders, but administrators capable of governing their vast territories according to Norman law and custom. These magnates became the foundation stones of the new order, each responsible for maintaining peace and extracting revenue from their assigned regions. Yet the feudal system was not merely about land and loyalty. It was fundamentally a military organization designed to maintain Norman rule against both internal rebellion and external invasion. Every tenant, from the greatest earl to the humblest knight, owed specified periods of military service to his lord, creating a theoretical force of several thousand heavy cavalry available to the crown in times of crisis. This military feudalism represented a revolution in English warfare, replacing the Anglo-Saxon fyrd with a professional warrior class trained from childhood in the arts of mounted combat. The transformation was not without its tensions and contradictions. Many Anglo-Saxon nobles had survived the conquest by submitting to William and accepting positions within the new hierarchy, but they found themselves perpetual outsiders in a system designed by and for their Norman overlords. The cultural divide between conqueror and conquered persisted for generations, manifested in language, law, and social custom. Norman French became the language of the court and of literature, while English persisted as the tongue of the common people, creating a linguistic stratification that would endure for centuries. The church, too, was integrated into this feudal structure, with bishops and abbots holding land by the same tenure as secular lords and owing the same military obligations. This ecclesiastical feudalism had profound implications for the relationship between church and state, creating tensions that would explode into open conflict in later reigns. Archbishop Lanfranc managed these contradictions with considerable skill, but the fundamental question of whether churchmen's primary loyalty lay with their spiritual or temporal superiors remained unresolved. At the base of this feudal pyramid stood the vast majority of the English population, the peasants and villeins whose labour supported the entire system. Their condition under Norman rule was complex and varied. While the conquest had not technically altered their legal status, the practical reality of their lives changed significantly as Norman lords imposed continental agricultural practices and administrative methods. The great manor houses that began to dot the English countryside were not merely residences, but centres of economic and judicial administration, where Norman stewards applied Norman law to English farmers, who often could not understand the language in which they were judged. William the Conqueror's later years were marked by the inevitable challenges that faced any medieval ruler attempting to govern a recently conquered kingdom while maintaining control over his ancestral lands across the Channel. The king who had once seemed invincible on the battlefield now struggled with the complexities of ruling an empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Loire Valley, each region demanding attention, resources, and the physical presence of the monarch himself. The division of William's attention between England and Normandy created opportunities for rebellion that his enemies were quick to exploit. In 1075, the revolt of the Earls tested the stability of Norman rule when three of the most powerful magnates in England, Roger de Breteuil, Earl of Hereford, Ralph de Wale, Earl of Norfolk, and Waltheof, Earl of Northumbria, conspired to divide the kingdom among themselves. The rebellion failed, crushed by the loyalty of other Norman lords and the efficiency of the administrative system William had created. But it demonstrated the fragility of the conquest settlement and the constant vigilance required to maintain it. More troubling still were the conflicts that arose within William's own family as his sons reached maturity and began to demand their inheritance of power. Robert Curthose, the eldest son and heir to Normandy, proved himself a capable warrior, but a restless subordinate, unwilling to wait patiently for his father's death to assume full authority. The relationship between father and son deteriorated into open warfare in the 1080s, with Robert allying himself with Philip the Fast of France in a series of campaigns that drained Norman resources and distracted William from English affairs. These family conflicts reflected deeper structural problems. within the Norman Empire that William had created. The medieval principle that kingdoms were personal property to be divided among heirs like any other inheritance conflicted with the practical necessities of governing complex political entities. William's decision to leave Normandy to Robert, while bequeathing England to his second son, William Rufus, was logical in terms of medieval inheritance law, but catastrophic for the unity of the Anglo-Norman realm. The conqueror's death in 1087, following injuries sustained during a campaign in the French Vexin, marked the end of an era but not the resolution of the contradictions inherent in his legacy. As he lay dying in Rouen, the great Norman capital, from which he had launched his conquest of England 21 years earlier, William must have understood that the empire he had built through military genius and administrative skill would face its greatest test in the hands of his successors. The bonds of personal loyalty that had held the Norman realm together were about to be tested by the competing ambitions of his sons and the enduring differences between his Norman and English subjects. William Rufus, who would rule England as William II, inherited not merely a kingdom, but a complex legacy of conquest, transformation, and unresolved tensions. The new king was in many ways his father's son, red-haired, energetic, and ruthless in pursuit of his goals, but he lacked the conqueror's unifying vision and his ability to balance the competing demands of Norman lords, English subjects, and continental politics. The England that Rufus inherited had been fundamentally transformed by 2 decades of Norman rule, yet it remained a work in progress, its ultimate character still to be determined by the actions and decisions of future generations. The administrative revolution that William the Conqueror had initiated was by now firmly established, with Norman innovations in government, law, and military organization having taken deep root in English soil. The great stone castles that dominated strategic locations throughout the kingdom stood as permanent monuments to Norman power, while the systematic replacement of Anglo-Saxon nobles with Norman settlers had created a new ruling class whose loyalties were necessarily divided between their English holdings and their continental origins. Yet beneath this Norman superstructure, older English traditions and institutions continued to evolve, creating a unique synthesis that would define medieval England's distinctive character. As the 11th century drew to a close, England stood transformed, yet still transforming, a kingdom where Norman ambition had grafted itself onto Anglo-Saxon roots to create something entirely new. The language spoken in the royal court was French, the architecture of power was Norman, and the social system was feudal, yet the underlying vitality of English culture and institutions ensured that this would not be mere conquest, but genuine synthesis. The next century would test whether this Norman English creation could survive the centrifugal forces that had destroyed so many other medieval empires, and whether the unity imposed by conquest could evolve into something more durable and authentically English. The death of Henry II in 1189 marked not an ending, but a transformation. Like autumn leaves surrendering to winter winds, one era yielded to another with both sorrow and anticipation. At Chinon Castle, where the old king drew his final breath, the very stones seemed to exhale with the weight of accumulated years, releasing the soul of a ruler whose iron will had shaped kingdoms, yet could not master his own son's rebellion. Richard, Duke of Aquitaine, stood now as King of England, though England itself felt almost incidental to his vast continental holdings. The crown that settled upon his brow carried the dreams of a warrior poet, a man whose heart beat not for the damp mists of his Northern Ireland kingdom, but for the blazing sun of distant lands where Christ's tomb lay in infidel hands. History would remember him as Richard the Lionheart, yet in that moment of coronation at Westminster Abbey, he was simply a 31-year-old duke stepping into an inheritance that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. The new king's first acts revealed the man beneath the crown. Where his father had been methodical, Richard was impetuous. Where Henry II had built administrative systems like a master craftsman, laying stone upon stone, Richard saw only resources to fuel grander ambitions. England became not a realm to govern, but a treasury to empty in service of his crusading dream. The very efficiency of his father's government now served Richard's opposite purpose, not to strengthen England, but to strip it of every possible penny for the holy war that consumed his imagination. Within months of his coronation, the kingdom witnessed a great selling. As if the crown jewels of state were spread upon a merchant's table, castles, lands, titles, privileges, all found new owners as Richard converted his inheritance into the golden sinews of war. "I would sell London itself if I could find a buyer," the king reportedly declared, and few doubted his sincerity. The jest carried truth as sharp as any blade. England had become the bankroll for a dream that lay 2,000 miles away. Yet there was something magnificent in this very excess, this absolute commitment to what medieval minds understood as the highest calling. When Richard took the cross in 1187, responding to news of Saladin's capture of Jerusalem, he joined not merely a military expedition, but a spiritual odyssey that promised to wash away sins in the blood of holy war. The Third Crusade beckoned like a siren song, and Richard would follow it beyond the horizon of prudent kingship into the realm of legend. The departure of the king in 1190 left England in the hands of regents, but more significantly, it left the kingdom in a strange suspended state, governed by an absent sovereign whose heart belonged to other lands. William Longchamp, the Norman-born chancellor, ruled with the authority of a man who knew his power derived entirely from a king who might never return. England had become, in effect, a feudal estate managed for an absentee landlord whose true interests lay in the capture of a distant city. News from the east trickled back like water through limestone, filtered and transformed by distance and desire. Richard's victories at Acre and Arsuf burnished his reputation until it gleamed like polished mail, yet they also revealed the terrible cost of his ambitions. The English treasury, once swollen with Henry II's careful accumulations, hemorrhaged, gold with each dispatch from the Holy Land. Ships departed Dover and Portsmouth laden with silver, bound for Italian ports where merchants waited to convert English wealth into Syrian steel and provisions for the crusading host. The king's absence stretched from months into years, and England learned to function like a body whose head remained perpetually turned away. The administrative machinery that Henry II had so carefully constructed continued to operate, but without the guiding intelligence that had designed it. Justices still rode their circuits, sheriffs still collected revenues, and the common law still evolved through precedent and practice. Yet the kingdom felt somehow hollow, as if its vital spirit had departed with the Lionheart's banners. Then came the news that every kingdom dreads. The king is taken. Richard's capture by Leopold of Austria in December 1192, followed by his transfer to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, transformed England's voluntary impoverishment into desperate necessity. The ransom demanded, 150,000 marks, a sum equivalent to twice the kingdom's annual revenue, would require sacrifices that made the crusading taxes seem modest by comparison. The great collection for Richard's ransom became a mirror reflecting the true nature of medieval society. Every social stratum contributed according to its capacity and station. The church surrendered its silver plate and golden ornaments, the nobility mortgaged their lands, and even the humblest peasants found their few coins counted toward their sovereign's freedom. Monasteries that had hoarded treasures for centuries saw their accumulated wealth carried away in the king's service, while manor lords discovered that loyalty to the crown could demand the sacrifice of generations of careful accumulation. Eleanor of Aquitaine, now past 70, but still formidable in her fierce maternal determination, became the driving force behind England's effort to secure her son's release. This remarkable woman, who had been Queen of France before becoming Queen of England, who had accompanied Louis VII on the Second Crusade and later rebelled against Henry II alongside her sons, now applied all her considerable political acumen to the singular task of bringing Richard home. She travelled ceaselessly between England and the continent, negotiating with princes and prelates, her presence lending authority to what might otherwise have seemed impossible demands upon the kingdom's resources. The raising of Richard's ransom revealed both the wealth that Henry II's reign had accumulated and the remarkable unity that could emerge when the kingdom faced an external crisis. From Cornwall to Northumberland, from the Welsh marches to the Scottish borders, England responded to the call with a solidarity that transcended local divisions. Even the Jewish communities, recently traumatized by the pogroms that had accompanied Richard's departure on crusade, contributed substantially to the collection, perhaps hoping to demonstrate their loyalty and secure protection for the future. When Richard finally returned to England in March 1194, after more than 4 years abroad, he found a kingdom transformed by his absence. The England he had left as a resource to be exploited had become, through necessity and shared sacrifice, something approaching a unified realm with its own distinctive identity. The very hardships imposed by his crusading ambitions and subsequent captivity had forged bonds between crown and subjects that mere administrative efficiency could never have created. Yet the Lionheart's heart remained unchanged. Within months of his return, having attended to the most pressing matters of governance and dealt with his brother John's attempted usurpation, Richard was planning new departures. The Holy Land still, called Jerusalem, remained in Muslim hands, and the king's crusading vows still bound his conscience. England had served its purpose in securing his freedom. Now it must serve again in funding his return to the East. The kingdom that had emptied its treasures to ransom its king now faced fresh demands for a new crusade. The fourth scutage of Richard's reign, imposed in 1195, fell upon a land still recovering from the enormous financial strain of the ransom. Yet there were signs that England was developing its own momentum, its own institutional life that could continue regardless of royal presence or absence. The justices in Eyre continued their circuits, refining and applying the common law that had emerged under Henry II. The Exchequer met regularly, its complex procedures for collecting and accounting royal revenue functioning with clockwork precision, despite the king's intermittent attention. In the forests and fields of England, life continued according to rhythms older than any dynasty. Peasants cleared new land and planted their crops, merchants extended their trade networks, and craftsmen perfected their skills, all largely independent of their sovereign's military adventures. Yet the king's character and choices shaped their lives in ways both direct and subtle. The heavy taxation required by crusading ambitions meant that surplus that might have been invested in local improvements instead flowed eastward, leaving communities to make do with less, while their lord pursued glory in foreign lands. Richard's death at Chalus in 1199, struck down by a crossbow bolt while besieging a minor castle in pursuit of disputed treasure, came with the sudden finality that characterized his entire reign. One moment the Lionheart lived, planning new campaigns and dreaming of future conquests. The next, medieval Europe's most celebrated warrior king lay dying in a crude castle courtyard, victim of what we might now call an industrial accident, the professional hazard of a military adventurer whose luck had finally run out. The succession crisis that followed revealed just how artificial the Angevin Empire had become. Built through marriage, conquest, and diplomatic maneuvering rather than organic growth, it depended entirely on the personal authority of its ruler to hold together. With Richard's death, the centrifugal forces that had been held in check by his reputation and personal charisma burst forth like water through a broken dam. John Lackland, youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor, assumed the throne through a combination of speed, proximity, and Eleanor's support, but his claim was immediately contested by Arthur of Brittany, son of John's deceased elder brother, Geoffrey. The dispute was more than dynastic. It reflected deeper questions about the nature of royal authority and the relationship between England and its continental possessions. Was the Angevin inheritance indivisible, or could it be partitioned among competing claimants? Did primogeniture automatically determine succession, or could other factors, competence, proximity, political support, override strict hereditary claims? Philip Augustus of France, now entering his mature years as a ruler and having learned patience through his conflicts with Richard, recognized in the succession dispute an opportunity that might not come again. Here was a chance to exploit the fundamental weakness of the Angevin Empire, its dependence on a single personality to maintain unity across vast distances and diverse populations. Where Richard had possessed the military reputation to cow potential enemies, and the crusading prestige to command respect. John brought to the throne primarily his failures, his attempted betrayal of Richard during the latter's captivity, his ineffective governance during the king's absences, and his general reputation for untrustworthiness. The new king's first challenge came not from foreign enemies, but from the basic task of establishing his legitimacy. John's coronation at Westminster Abbey in May 1199 was conducted with all proper ceremony, yet it could not disguise the reality that significant portions of his supposed realm did not acknowledge his authority. In Brittany, Arthur maintained his claim with French support. In Anjou and Maine, the nobility remained divided. Even in Normandy, John's ancestral duchy, his position was less secure than might have been expected. John's early years as king revealed both his limitations and his genuine administrative abilities. Where Richard had been careless with the details of governance, John proved surprisingly attentive to bureaucratic precision. The chancery rolls from his reign show a king who involved himself deeply in the day-to-day business of ruling, reviewing judicial decisions, granting charters, and supervising the collection of revenues with a thoroughness that would have impressed his father Henry II. Yet this very attention to detail sometimes worked against him, creating an impression of suspicious micromanagement rather than confident leadership. The crisis that would define John's reign and transform medieval England began almost imperceptibly in 1200, with his marriage to Isabella of Angoulême. The bride was both beautiful and strategically important. Her father's lands commanded key routes between Poitou and Gascony. But she was also already betrothed to Hugh de Lusignan, one of the most powerful barons in Poitou. John's decision to marry Isabella himself, breaking her existing engagement, was the kind of high-handed action that medieval law and custom considered deeply problematic. The offence to the Lusignan family was both personal and political, touching on fundamental questions of honour and feudal obligation. When Hugh de Lusignan appealed to Philip Augustus as overlord of the disputed territories, he initiated a legal process that would culminate in the loss of Normandy. The French king, acting in his capacity as feudal superior, summoned John to answer charges at the Court of Peers. John's refusal to appear, claiming that as King of England he was not subject to French jurisdiction, provided Philip with the legal pretext he needed to declare John's French fiefs forfeit. The war that followed was unlike the great military adventures of Richard's time. Instead of dramatic sieges and heroic charges, it was characterized by systematic conquest, careful logistics, and the gradual erosion of John's position through superior French organization and diplomacy. Philip Augustus had learned from his earlier conflicts with the Angevins that spectacular victories were less important than steady pressure and the methodical reduction of enemy strongholds. The fall of Château Gaillard in March 1204 symbolized the end of an era. This massive fortress, built by Richard III to guard the approaches to Rouen, had been considered virtually impregnable. Its surrender, after an 8-month siege, opened the heart of Normandy to French conquest and demonstrated that even the Lionheart's military engineering could not compensate for the political and financial weaknesses that John had inherited. The Loss of Normandy was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological shock that reverberated throughout the English political system. For nearly a century and a half, since the Norman Conquest of 1066, England's rulers had been fundamentally Norman, with estates and interests on both sides of the Channel. The great barons who had supported the Norman and Angevin kings were similarly bicultural, holding lands in both England and Normandy, and moving freely between them according to season and opportunity. Now, suddenly, this integrated world was sundered. The nobles who had served the Angevin kings faced an agonizing choice: remain loyal to John and lose their Norman estates, or transfer their allegiance to Philip Augustus and risk their English holdings. Some, like the powerful William Marshal, found ways to navigate between the competing authorities, but for most, the loss of Normandy meant choosing between two incompatible loyalties and accepting the permanent diminishment of their wealth and status. For England itself, The consequences were paradoxically both traumatic and liberating. The trauma was immediate and obvious. The kingdom had lost prestige, revenue, and strategic depth. English kings were now confined to their island realm plus scattered holdings in Gascony and Ireland, a dramatic reduction from the continental empire that had seemed so formidable under Henry II and Richard. The financial cost of failed military campaigns to recover the lost territories would plague John's government for the remainder of his reign. Yet the liberation was equally real, though slower to manifest. Freed from the need to defend far-flung continental possessions, England could begin to develop its own distinctive identity and institutions. The Norman French culture that had dominated the court since 1066 gradually gave way to something more recognizably English. The language spoken in manor houses and royal councils slowly shifted from French toward the vernacular that would eventually become Middle English. Most importantly, the political nation, the barons, bishops, and royal officials who actually governed the kingdom, became more uniformly English in their interests and outlook. John's response to the loss of Normandy revealed both his determination and his limitations as a ruler. He immediately began planning for reconquest, imposing new taxes and military obligations on his English subjects in preparation for campaigns to recover his lost inheritance. The scutage levied in 1204 was the first of 11 such exactions during John's reign, each one heavier than the last, as the king desperately sought to rebuild his military resources. The administrative machinery of government, already sophisticated under John's predecessors, became even more efficient and intrusive as the king sought to extract maximum revenue from his remaining territories. The exchequer developed new techniques for assessing and collecting taxes. Royal justices were instructed to look more carefully for sources of revenue in their judicial proceedings. Forest law, always unpopular, was enforced with renewed rigor as John sought to maximize income from this traditional royal prerogative. The decade following the loss of Normandy witnessed the slow transformation of political grievance into constitutional crisis. John's attempts to recover his continental losses created a spiral of taxation and administrative pressure that gradually united his subjects in opposition to royal policy. What began as grumbling about specific financial exactions evolved into fundamental questions about the nature and limits of royal authority. The king's character, always his greatest political liability, was magnified by the pressures of his situation. Where a more trusted ruler might have secured cooperation for extraordinary measures, John's reputation for faithlessness made every demand suspect. Stories of his cruelty and vindictiveness, some true, others perhaps exaggerated but widely believed, created an atmosphere of fear and resentment that poisoned relationships between crown and subjects. The conflict with Pope Innocent III over the Canterbury election, beginning in 1205, added ecclesiastical grievances to the growing list of baronial complaints. When John rejected the papal candidate Stephen Langton and refused to accept Innocent's authority in the matter, he initiated a struggle that would culminate in England's placement under interdict and his own excommunication. The sight of a kingdom where church services ceased, where the dead lay unburied in consecrated ground, and where the sacraments were denied to the faithful, created a profound psychological crisis that many interpreted as divine judgment upon the king's misrule. Yet even in this extremity, John demonstrated the administrative competence that was perhaps his greatest strength as a ruler. The systematic confiscation of ecclesiastical properties during the interdict was carried out with ruthless efficiency, adding substantial sums to royal revenues while maintaining the basic functions of government. The king's officials proved remarkably adept at managing a realm where the usual religious ceremonies and confirmations were suspended, suggesting that the secular state was becoming more autonomous from ecclesiastical support than might have been expected. The baronial opposition that eventually crystallized into armed rebellion drew its strength from multiple sources of discontent. The heavy taxation required by John's military ambitions created obvious grievances, particularly among landholders who saw their traditional obligations expanded far beyond customary limits. The arbitrary nature of royal justice, exemplified by crushing fines imposed for relatively minor offences, convinced many that the king regarded his subjects merely as sources of revenue rather than as partners in governance. More fundamentally, the barons began to articulate a theory of limited monarchy that challenged the unlimited authority that Angevin kings had claimed, drawing on half-remembered traditions from Anglo-Saxon times and idealized concepts of feudal obligation. The opposition developed arguments that royal power must be exercised according to law and custom rather than mere will. The king, they argued, was bound by the same legal constraints that governed relations between all levels of society. The military catalyst for rebellion came with the disastrous expedition to Poitou in 1214. John's attempt to recover his continental losses through alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor ended in crushing defeat at the Battle of Bouvines, where Philip Augustus decisively routed the coalition that had seemed to offer the best hope for reversing French conquests. The defeat not only ended realistic prospects for recovering Normandy, but also demonstrated that John's military leadership was as flawed as his political judgment. The barons who assembled at Stamford after Easter 1215 represented not a faction, but something approaching a national movement. From the northern lords like Eustace de Vesci and Robert de Ros to the eastern magnates like Geoffrey de Mandeville and Robert Fitzwalter, the rebellion drew support from across the kingdom. These were not marginal figures or chronic malcontents, but established members of the political nation who had concluded that John's kingship had become incompatible with the kingdom's welfare. The document they produced, initially known as the Articles of the Barons but eventually styled Magna Carta, was simultaneously revolutionary and conservative. Revolutionary in its explicit limitation of royal authority and its detailed enumeration of specific constraints on monarchical power, conservative in its appeal to traditional rights and its assumption that good governance required the restoration of ancient customs rather than the innovation of new institutions. The famous meadow of Runnymede, where king and barons met in June 1215 to negotiate the terms of their agreement, seemed an unlikely setting for one of history's most significant constitutional moments. This waterlogged field beside the Thames, chosen precisely because it was neutral ground, belonging to neither party, witnessed conversations that would echo through centuries of political development. Here, for the first time in medieval Europe, a king formally acknowledged that his authority was subject to legal constraints that could be enforced by his subjects. The specific provisions of Magna Carta reflected the particular grievances that had driven the barons to rebellion, but their cumulative effect was to establish principles that extended far beyond the immediate concerns of feudal landholders. The guarantee that no free man would be imprisoned or dispossessed except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land established due process as a fundamental right. The promise that justice would not be sold, denied, or delayed created an expectation that legal proceedings would be conducted according to consistent and public standards. Perhaps most significantly, the Charter established the principle that the king himself was subject to law. The elaborate provisions for enforcing the agreement, including the right of 25 barons to make war on the king if he violated its terms, demonstrated that royal promises were to be treated as legally binding obligations rather than mere expressions of good intentions. This was truly revolutionary in a world where kings traditionally claimed to rule by divine right and to be accountable only to God. John's acceptance of Magna Carta was clearly tactical rather than sincere. Within weeks of the ceremony at Runnymede, he was seeking papal annulment of an agreement made under duress. Pope Innocent III, despite his recent conflicts with John, proved sympathetic to royal arguments that the Charter represented an unacceptable limitation on legitimate monarchical authority. The papal bull declaring Magna Carta null and void arrived in England just as both sides were preparing to resume hostilities. The civil war that followed Runnymede was brief but vicious. The baronial army, strengthened by support from London, and several key castles, initially held its own against royal forces. However, John's decision to hire continental mercenaries and his appeal for support from loyalist barons gradually shifted the military balance. More decisively, the rebels' invitation to Prince Louis of France to accept the English crown internationalized the conflict in ways that ultimately weakened their position. The arrival of French forces in England in May 1216 transformed what had been a constitutional crisis into something resembling a war of succession. Louis's claim to the throne, based on his marriage to Blanche of Castile and her descent from Eleanor of Aquitaine, was legally questionable but politically attractive to barons who had despaired of achieving reform through negotiation with John. Yet the presence of foreign troops on English soil also enabled John to present himself as a patriotic king defending the realm against invasion. John's death at Newark in October 1216, apparently from dysentery contracted during his campaign in the eastern counties, came at the moment when his military position was beginning to improve. The king who had lost Normandy, been excommunicated by the Pope, and forced to accept limitations on his authority by his own subjects, died still fighting to maintain his throne against foreign invasion and domestic rebellion. His passing removed the personal animosity that had done so much to poison political relationships, creating opportunities for reconciliation that had seemed impossible while he lived. The 9-year-old boy who became Henry III upon his father's death inherited a kingdom torn by civil war and occupied by foreign troops, yet his very youth proved to be a political asset. Where John's character had made compromise impossible, Henry's minority created space for the moderate voices that had been drowned out by the extremism of the final years. The Regency government, headed by William Marshal, the most respected knight of his generation, could pursue reconciliation precisely because it did not carry the burden of John's accumulated grievances. The coronation of Henry III at Gloucester Abbey in October 1216 was both expedient and symbolic. With London held by French forces and Westminster Abbey inaccessible, the ceremony had to be conducted with whatever resources were available. The papal legate Guala Bicchieri performed the rites, emphasizing the new king's legitimacy in the eyes of the church, while William Marshal, despite his advanced age, took on the burden of governing in the royal name. The improvised nature of the proceedings somehow made them more rather than less impressive, demonstrating that English kingship could survive even the most adverse circumstances. The reissue of Magna Carta in November 1216, modified to remove its most objectionable provisions but retaining its essential principles, was the master stroke that made reconciliation possible. By acknowledging that the Charter represented legitimate concerns rather than treasonous demands, the Regency government offered the rebels an honourable path back to allegiance. The new version, issued in the name of a child king who could hardly be held responsible for his father's failures, allowed both sides to step back from positions that had become unsustainable. The defeat of Prince Louis at the naval battle of Sandwich in August 1217 effectively ended French hopes of conquering England. But the Regency government's magnanimous treatment of the defeated rebels was equally important in restoring stability. Rather than pursuing vengeance against those who had invited foreign invasion, William Marshal and his colleagues offered pardons and restitution of estates. This policy of reconciliation, unprecedented in medieval politics, created lasting loyalty among former enemies and established patterns of moderation that would characterize much of Henry's long reign. The gradual restoration of normal government during Henry's minority revealed how thoroughly the administrative innovations of the Angevin kings had taken root. Despite years of civil war and the disruption caused by foreign invasion, the basic machinery of royal administration continued to function. Sheriffs collected revenues, justices heard cases, and royal clerks maintained records with remarkable continuity. The Chancery rolls for these years show a government that, while necessarily limited in its ambitions, maintained the essential services that medieval subjects expected from their rulers. William Marshal's death in 1219 marked the end of an era that had stretched back to the early years of Henry II. This remarkable man, who had served 4 kings with unwavering loyalty while maintaining his reputation for honour and integrity, embodied the chivalric ideals that were becoming increasingly important in 13th century culture. His biography, written shortly after his death, presents a picture of the perfect knight whose devotion to duty transcended personal advantage, an ideal that would influence political behaviour throughout the remainder of the medieval period. The Regency that followed Marshal's death dominated by Hubert de Burgh and Peter de Roche, was less harmonious but equally effective in maintaining governmental continuity. The rivalry between these two men, de Burgh representing the English baronial interest and de Roche's the continental administrative tradition, reflected broader tensions within the political nation. Yet their competition for influence was conducted within accepted constitutional bounds, demonstrating that the lessons of John's reign had been thoroughly absorbed. Henry's assumption of personal rule in 1227, at the age of 20, coincided with a period of economic expansion and cultural flowering that seemed to vindicate the policies of moderation that had characterized his minority. The kingdom that the young king inherited was smaller than the Angevin Empire at its height, but more unified and arguably more prosperous. The loss of continental territories had forced England to develop its own resources and trade networks, leading to innovations in agriculture, manufacturing, and commerce that would provide the foundation for future growth. The king's character, revealed gradually as he matured, proved to be almost the opposite of his father's. Where John had been suspicious and calculating, Henry was trusting and impulsive. Where John had been ruthlessly efficient in financial matters, Henry was generous to a fault. Where John had been politically astute but personally treacherous, Henry was personally loyal but often politically naive. These contrasts, while making Henry a more attractive personality than his father, would create their own problems as the reign progressed. Henry's marriage to Eleanor of Provence in 1236 brought new influences into English political life that would have far-reaching consequences. The young queen arrived with a retinue of relatives and friends who expected to be rewarded for their service, creating resentment among English nobles who felt excluded from royal favour. More significantly, Eleanor's connection to the sophisticated court culture of southern France introduced artistic and intellectual influences that would transform English civilization while simultaneously creating suspicion about foreign corruption of native traditions. The architectural projects that Henry initiated during his personal rule reflected both his artistic sensibilities and his understanding of kingship as a form of public performance. The rebuilding of Westminster Abbey, begun in the 1240s in conscious imitation of the new Gothic cathedrals of France, was intended to create a setting worthy of English royal ceremonies, while demonstrating the cultural sophistication of the Plantagenet court. The enormous expense of this project, like that of the king's other building initiatives, would become a source of political controversy. Yet the artistic achievement was undeniable. The legal developments that continued during Henry's early personal rule built upon the foundations laid by his predecessors while responding to new social and economic conditions. The emergence of borough courts to handle commercial disputes reflected the growing importance of trade and manufacturing. The expansion of royal jurisdiction over matters previously handled by local courts demonstrated the increasing authority of common law. Most significantly, the regular meetings of royal justices began to develop consistent procedures and remedies that would eventually be codified as distinctively English legal traditions. The financial pressures that had characterized John's reign persisted under Henry, though they were handled with greater sensitivity to political realities. The king's ambitions, whether for recovering continental territories, supporting papal policies, or funding elaborate building projects, consistently exceeded his resources, requiring frequent negotiations with the barons for additional taxation. These discussions, conducted through assemblies that were beginning to be called parliaments, gradually developed into constitutional conventions about the circumstances under which extraordinary levies could be imposed. The political crisis that would dominate the latter half of Henry III's reign had its roots in the very success of the earlier years. The prosperity and stability that had marked the decades following the Civil War created expectations about royal behaviour that Henry, influenced by continental models of kingship, was increasingly unwilling to meet. The king's vision of monarchy drew inspiration from the courts of France and the Holy Roman Empire, where rulers claimed absolute authority over their subjects and expected unquestioning obedience to royal commands. The growing influence of Henry's Poitevin relatives, brought to England after his marriage to Eleanor of Provence, symbolized the cultural tensions that were developing within the English political nation. These foreign advisors, led by the Queen's uncles Peter of Aigueblanche and Boniface of Savoy, were undoubtedly competent administrators and loyal servants of the crown, yet their prominence at court created resentment among English barons who felt that their traditional role as royal councillors was being usurped by outsiders who understood neither English customs nor English interests. The financial demands associated with Henry's continental ambitions provided the immediate catalyst for political opposition. The king's acceptance of the papal offer of the Sicilian crown for his son Edmund in 1254 was a diplomatic masterstroke that promised to restore Plantagenet influence in European affairs. However, the enormous subsidy required to support this venture, reportedly 135,000 marks, exceeded anything that had been demanded since the ransom of Richard I. Even more problematically, the commitment was made without consulting the barons whose contributions would be essential to its fulfillment. The Parliament that met at Westminster in April 1258 witnessed scenes unprecedented in English political history. Led by Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, the assembled barons presented the king with what amounted to an ultimatum: accept fundamental reforms in governmental structure or face armed resistance. The grievances they articulated went beyond immediate financial concerns to challenge the entire system of personal monarchy that the Angevins had developed. Royal administration, they argued, had become both too expensive and too arbitrary, serving the king's private interests rather than the kingdom's welfare. The provisions of Oxford, agreed to by Henry after months of negotiation, represented the most radical limitation of royal authority since Magna Carta. The establishment of a council of 15 barons with authority to oversee royal policy, the requirement that major appointments be subject to baronial approval, and the regular convening of parliaments to review governmental performance created what was effectively a constitutional monarchy decades before such concepts became common in European political thought. Simon de Montfort emerged from these negotiations as the dominant figure in English politics, though his authority rested on the fragile foundation of baronial unity rather than any formal constitutional position. This remarkable man, French by birth but English by adoption, combined genuine political vision with ruthless ambition in ways that made him simultaneously admirable and dangerous. His commitment to reforming royal government was undoubtedly sincere, yet his methods often seemed to contradict the very principles of lawful constraint that he claimed to champion. The years of baronial government that followed the provisions of Oxford demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of collective rule. The council system functioned effectively in addressing many of the grievances that had motivated the reform movement. Royal expenditure was brought under control, administrative abuses were corrected, and governmental policy began to reflect broader interests than merely those of the court. Yet the barons proved no more capable than the king of transcending factional interests and personal ambitions. Henry's repudiation of the provisions in 1261, supported by a papal bull releasing him from oaths made under duress, initiated the final phase of the constitutional crisis. The king's attempt to restore personal rule with the support of his foreign relatives and mercenary troops recreated many of the conditions that had led to the original confrontation. More fatally, it convinced moderate barons who had hoped for gradual reform that only force could constrain royal arbitrariness. The civil war that erupted in 1263 differed fundamentally from the baronial rebellion against King John. Where the earlier conflict had been primarily about specific grievances against particular royal policies, the struggle between Henry III and Simon de Montfort represented competing visions of governmental structure. De Montfort and his supporters argued for what we might recognize as constitutional monarchy, with royal authority limited by law and subject to regular review by representative assemblies. Henry and his loyalists defended traditional concepts of kingship, with the monarch accountable only to God and possessed of inherent authority over all aspects of governance. The Battle of Lewes in May 1264 was one of the most significant military encounters in medieval English history, not because of its scale, the armies involved were relatively small, but because of its political consequences. De Montfort's victory placed the king and his eldest son Edward in baronial custody and established what was effectively a revolutionary government committed to implementing the constitutional reforms that Henry had rejected. For the first time since the Norman Conquest, English royal authority was subordinated to principles that its holders had not voluntarily accepted. The Parliament summoned by Simon de Montfort in January 1265 was remarkable for its inclusion of representatives from boroughs as well as counties, expanding political participation beyond the traditional feudal elite. This innovation, driven partly by de Montfort's need for broader support against royalist opposition, established precedents that would influence the development of parliamentary institutions for centuries to come. The presence of burgesses and knights alongside earls and bishops created a more diverse political assembly than any previous English gathering. Yet, de Montfort's revolutionary government contained the seeds of its own destruction. The earls' increasing reliance on popular support alienated moderate barons, who had initially supported reform but were uncomfortable with challenges to social hierarchy. His alliance with Llewellyn ap Gruffydd of Wales seemed treasonous to English nobles who regarded the Welsh as natural enemies. Most fatally, his inability to control his own supporters led to excesses that discredited the reform movement and provided opportunities for royal recovery. The escape of Prince Edward from baronial custody in May 1265 transformed the political situation almost overnight. This vigorous young man, already showing the military talents that would make him one of medieval Europe's most formidable warriors, quickly assembled a royalist army that reversed the military balance. The Battle of Evesham in August 1265, where Simon de Montfort was killed along with most of his key supporters, effectively ended the baronial revolution and restored Henry III to effective authority. The settlement that followed Evesham was remarkably moderate, reflecting lessons learned from the cycles of violence that had characterized earlier political crises. The Dictum of Kenilworth, issued in 1266, offered pardons to former rebels in exchange for financial penalties, rather than the forfeitures and executions that might have been expected. This policy of reconciliation, actively promoted by papal legates who were eager to restore stability, gradually reintegrated most of the former opposition into the political nation. Henry's final years were marked by a gradual transition of effective authority to his son Edward, who had emerged from the baronial wars as the dominant figure in English politics. The old king, now in his 60s and perhaps exhausted by decades of political conflict, seemed content to focus on his architectural and artistic projects, while the heir apparent assumed responsibility for the more demanding aspects of governance. This informal regency arrangement worked smoothly because both father and son had learned to avoid the arbitrary behavior that had precipitated earlier crises. The legal and administrative innovations that emerged from the baronial period proved more durable than the specific political arrangements that had produced them. The regular summoning of parliaments, the principle that extraordinary taxation required consent, and the expectation that royal policy should be subject to public scrutiny all became established features of English governance. Most significantly, the idea that even kings were bound by law, first articulated in Magna Carta and refined through decades of political struggle, had become a fundamental assumption of English political culture. Henry III's death in November 1272 marked the end of the longest reign in medieval English history and closed a chapter that had witnessed the transformation of English kingship from personal autocracy toward constitutional monarchy. The kingdom that passed to Edward the Firm was more prosperous, more unified, and more politically sophisticated than the war-torn realm that Henry had inherited as a child. The institutions of government had proven their resilience through decades of crisis and reform, while the concept of the rule of law had become so deeply embedded in English political consciousness that future kings would violate it at their peril. As winter settled over the Thames Valley in that year of 1272, and as the bells of Westminster Abbey tolled for the king who had rebuilt it in stone and glory, England stood transformed. The realm that had begun the century as part of a continental empire now possessed its own distinctive identity and institutions. The language of its courts was becoming English rather than French. Its laws were developing along indigenous lines, and its political culture was evolving toward forms that would be recognized by much later generations as fundamentally constitutional. In the deep silence of that November evening, as Henry III was laid to rest beside the shrine of Edward the Confessor he had so revered, medieval England had found both its voice and its character, characteristics that would echo through all the centuries to come. The crown passed to a man whose very name would echo through centuries like the ring of hammer on anvil. Edward, called Longshanks for his towering frame, ascended the throne in 1272 with ambitions that stretched far beyond England's ancient borders. Where his father Henry had been a builder of cathedrals and collector of art, Edward was forged for conquest, his soul attuned to the thunder of cavalry and the geometry of siege warfare. In the rolling hills of Wales, where mist clung to ancient stones and Celtic songs still whispered through mountain passes, the last princes of an independent realm prepared for their final stand. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, Prince of Wales, had ruled his ancestral lands with the fierce pride of a people who remembered freedom. But Edward's gaze had turned westward, and where the Plantagenet eye fell, the Plantagenet sword was sure to follow. The conquest of Wales unfolded like a chess game played with armies. Edward moved with methodical precision, building a ring of stone fortresses that would outlast kingdoms. Conway, Caernarfon, Harlech, names that became synonymous with English power and Welsh loss. Each castle rose like a mountain of hewn stone, its walls speaking a language of dominion that needed no translation. From their towers, English garrisons looked out over a landscape forever changed, while Welsh bards wept songs of ending into the wind. Llywelyn died in 1282, cut down in a skirmish near Builth Wells, and with him died the last flicker of Welsh independence. His brother Dafydd continued the struggle for a few desperate months, but by summer's end, he too had fallen to English justice. Edward had his prize, and Wales became not a conquest, but an extension of England itself. Its princes, henceforth, to be English-born and English-hearted. Yet it was northward that Edward's most fateful steps would lead. Scotland, that kingdom of lochs and highlands, of ancient stones and fierce clans, beckoned with a different kind of challenge. When Alexander III of Scotland died childless in 1286, leaving only his granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, as heir, Edward saw opportunity gleaming like gold in northern streams. The child queen died before reaching her throne, and Scotland faced a succession crisis that would summon the wolves. Multiple claimants emerged, each with bloodlines tracing back through generations of Scottish royalty. Robert Bruce and John Balliol stood foremost among them, their rivalry destined to reshape the northern kingdom. Edward, invited to arbitrate as overlord, chose John Balliol, believing him the more malleable puppet. It was a calculation that would prove as costly as it was clever. Balliol's reign began in Edward's shadow, every decision requiring English approval, every act of independence met with swift correction. The Scots, proud as mountain eagles, chafed under this arrangement. When Edward demanded Scottish troops for his wars in France, the breaking point arrived like thunder after lightning. Scotland struck an alliance with France, the beginning of what would become known as the Auld Alliance, and Edward's fury burned white-hot. The sack of Berwick in 1296 announced Edward's intentions with brutal clarity. The border town, once Scotland's wealthiest port, became a charnel house where English soldiers showed no mercy to age or gender. Thousands died in streets that ran red with Scottish blood, and the message rang clear across the lowlands. Rebellion would be met with annihilation. John Balliol, stripped of his crown and royal regalia in a ceremony designed to humiliate, earned the bitter nickname Tomb Tabard, the empty coat. Scotland seemed conquered, its nobility cowed, its independence extinguished. Edward seized the Stone of Destiny from Scone Abbey, that ancient symbol of Scottish kingship, and carried it south to Westminster, where it would remain for 7 centuries. The kingdom appeared as dead as winter, but Scotland's heart still beat, hidden in the heather and pulsing through Highland streams. In 1297, as Edward campaigned in Flanders, Rebellion sparked like flame in dry grass. William Wallace, a younger son of minor nobility from Renfrewshire, raised his sword not for personal gain, but for an idea that burned brighter than gold, that Scotland belonged to the Scots. Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge became the stuff of legend before the bodies were cold. The Scottish army, outnumbered and outmatched, turned geography into ally and English arrogance into weakness. As half the English army crossed the narrow bridge over the River Forth, Wallace struck with the fury of a Highland storm. The Earl of Surrey's force, trapped between water and Scottish steel, died by the hundreds while their commanders watched helplessly from the far bank. For a golden year, Wallace ruled Scotland as guardian, and the dream of independence burned bright once more. He raided deep into Northumberland, carrying fire and sword to English soil, proving that the hammer of the Scots could himself be struck. But Edward returned from his continental adventures with vengeance singing in his veins, and at Falkirk in 1298, the reality of warfare crushed romantic dreams like millstones grinding grain. The English longbow, that revolutionary weapon which would dominate battlefields for centuries, announced its lethal precision to the world at Falkirk. Scottish schiltrons, those hedgehog formations of spearmen that had served so well at Stirling, became death traps under clouds of English arrows. The sky darkened with shafts that fell like deadly rain, each flight cutting down Scottish hopes, along with Scottish warriors. Wallace escaped the slaughter, but his power was broken. For 7 years, he lived as a fugitive, hunted through glen and forest, sustained only by the loyalty of common folk who saw in him something greater than kingship, the spirit of a people who refused to bow. When treachery finally delivered him to English hands in 1305, his trial and execution became theatre of the most savage kind. In London, before jeering crowds, Wallace faced the full horror of English justice for treason, dragged through the streets, hanged until nearly dead, then disemboweled while still conscious. His body was finally quartered, and his head mounted on London Bridge. Edward meant to make an example that would echo through every Scottish household, but instead, he created a martyr whose memory would outlive empires. From Wallace's ashes rose a king who would transform Scotland forever. Robert Bruce, grandson of the Balliol rival, had played a complex game during the Wars of Independence, sometimes supporting Edward, sometimes joining the resistance. But in 1306, standing before the high altar of Scone Abbey, he grasped the crown of Scotland with hands that would never release it. Bruce's early reign read like a catalogue of disasters. Defeated at Methven, hunted like a wolf through the Western Isles, reduced to a handful of followers living in caves, he seemed destined for the same fate as Wallace. His brothers were captured and executed, his wife and daughter imprisoned in English castles, his supporters scattered to the four winds. Yet in those dark months, Bruce learned lessons that would serve him well: patience, cunning, and the art of fighting wars that conventional armies could not win. The spider in its web, spinning thread after broken thread until finally achieving success. This tale, whether true or legend, captured the essence of Bruce's strategy. He built his rebellion thread by thread, victory by small victory, teaching his men to strike like shadows and vanish like mist. When Edward's armies came north, they found castles empty, supplies destroyed, countryside hostile. The Scots had learned to make the land itself their weapon. Edward the First died in 1307 at Berg by Sands, within sight of the Scottish border, his last breath exhaled in pursuit of Scottish submission. His son, Edward II, inherited the throne, but not the iron will that had made his father the hammer of the Scots. Where the first Edward had been methodical and relentless, the second was weak and easily distracted, more interested in the company of his favourites than the conquest of Scotland. Bruce seized this opportunity like a falcon stooping on prey. One by one, Scottish castles fell to his forces, not through great sieges, but through cunning, treachery, and the slow, patient work of men who fought for their homes. Perth, Linlithgow, Edinburgh. Each fell with minimal bloodshed, their English garrisons expelled rather than slaughtered, for Bruce understood that mercy could be more powerful than the sword. By 1314, Only Stirling Castle remained in English hands, its garrison isolated like an island in a Scottish sea. When its commander, Sir Philip Mowbray, agreed to surrender unless relieved by midsummer, Edward II had no choice but to march north with the largest army England had ever assembled. The stage was set for a battle that would decide Scotland's fate for centuries to come. Bannockburn flowed quietly through the countryside south of Stirling, its banks green with summer grass, its waters clear as crystal. On June 23rd and 24th, 1314, those peaceful fields became the crucible where Scottish independence was forged in blood and steel. Bruce had chosen his ground with the eye of a master tactician, forcing the English to attack across boggy ground against disciplined Scottish schiltrons positioned on higher ground. The battle began with individual combat worthy of ancient epics. Henry de Bohun, spotting Bruce reconnoitring alone on his small grey palfrey, spurred his heavy warhorse forward with lance levelled, seeking glory and immortality. Bruce, armed only with a battle-axe, met the charge with supernatural calm. At the last moment, he swerved aside and brought his weapon down with such force that it split both helmet and skull, killing de Bohun instantly and shattering the axe handle. The next day brought the main engagement, and with it the collapse of English power in Scotland. The great English cavalry, pride of medieval warfare, became trapped in boggy ground between the Bannockburn and the Pell Stream, unable to manoeuvre, vulnerable to Scottish spears. The Earl of Gloucester died in the first charge, his banner trampled in Scottish mud. Soon the entire English host was in retreat, their king fleeing toward Dunbar with his personal guard while his army disintegrated behind him. Scotland had won more than a battle. It had won the right to exist. Bruce's kingship, blessed by victory, became unshakable. In 1320, the Declaration of Arbroath proclaimed to Pope and world that Scotland would bow to no foreign lord, that its people would choose death before dishonour. The document's words rang like bells across Europe. For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. While Scotland celebrated freedom, England writhed under a king whose weaknesses multiplied like shadows at sunset. Edward II, tall and handsome like his father but lacking every quality that made a medieval monarch successful, presided over a realm sliding toward chaos. His passion for unsuitable favourites, his indifference to the arts of war and governance, his inability to command respect from his own nobles, all these failings combined to create a crisis that would consume his reign. Piers Gaveston, the Gascon, knight who captured Edward's heart and dominated his council, became the lightning rod for baronial anger. The favourite's arrogance, his monopoly on royal favour, his accumulation of wealth and titles at the expense of English nobles, these grievances festered until they burst into open rebellion. In 1312, the Earl of Warwick and his allies kidnapped Gaveston and executed him on Blacklow Hill, their knives ending both a life and Edward's first great love. The king's grief transformed into fury, but fury without strength behind it becomes mere petulance. Edward's attempts at revenge failed miserably, succeeding only in deepening the divisions within his realm. At Bannockburn, his humiliation became complete, the memory of his flight from the battlefield haunting his remaining years like an unquiet ghost. New favourites arose to replace Gaveston, the Despensers, father and son, whose greed made the dead Gascons seem modest by comparison. They sucked the realm dry like leeches, accumulating lands and offices until their power rivaled the king's own. The older Despenser had served Edward III faithfully, but his son proved to be a cancer growing in the heart of English government, his ambitions fed by royal weakness and protected by royal favouritism. Queen Isabella, the she-wolf of France, watched her husband's degradation with eyes that burned like winter stars, beautiful, intelligent, and ruthless when necessary. She had married Edward in 1308 as a political alliance between England and France. For years she endured his neglect, his preference for male favourites, his indifference to her counsel. But patience has limits, even in queens, and Isabella's limit approached like tide reaching its flood. The baronial opposition found its leader in Thomas of Lancaster, Edward III's nephew, whose vast lands and fierce pride made him Edward II's natural enemy. Lancaster possessed every virtue the king lacked: military skill, political acumen, noble bearing, and most importantly, the respect of his peers. The confrontation between king and earl became inevitable, like the collision of storm clouds heavy with rain. Civil war erupted in 1321, its flames fanned by years of accumulated grievances. The Despensers fled into exile, but their absence only emboldened Lancaster and his allies. For a moment, it seemed as though Edward might face the same fate as his ancestor John, forced to submit to his noble's will or lose his crown entirely. But war is unpredictable, and at Boroughbridge in 1322, Lancaster's luck finally failed him. The Earl of Lancaster died on a muddy hill overlooking his own castle, executed like a common traitor after a trial that was mere formality. His death removed Edward's greatest enemy, but solved none of England's deeper problems. The Despensers returned from exile more rapacious than before, their enemies cowed but not converted, their power resting on royal favour alone. It was a foundation, built on sand, and Isabella prepared to bring the tide. In 1325, Isabella crossed the Channel to France on what appeared to be a diplomatic mission. Her brother, Charles IV, had seized English lands in Gascony, and traditional diplomacy had failed to resolve the crisis. But Isabella's true purpose went far deeper than recovering lost territories. In her homeland's court, she found both sanctuary and the ally she needed: Roger Mortimer, Earl of March, who had escaped from the Tower of London in a feat worthy of legend. Mortimer had been Lancaster's ally, imprisoned after Boroughbridge, seemingly doomed to rot in English dungeons. But prison walls could not contain a man of his resourcefulness. On August 1st, 1323, he drugged his guards and escaped through a tunnel that had been secretly dug beneath the tower. A boat waited in the Thames, and by dawn he was free, making his way to the continent where other English exiles gathered like storm clouds. The attraction between Isabella and Mortimer burned with the intensity of shared purpose and mutual need. She required a soldier capable of overthrowing her husband. He needed royal legitimacy for his ambitions. Their alliance quickly became intimate, scandalizing courts across Europe but creating a partnership more dangerous to Edward II than any army. When Isabella refused to return to England, bringing her son Edward with her, the game entered its final phase. The future Edward III, barely 14 years old, became both pawn and prize in his parents' struggle. Isabella had him perform homage to her brother for Gascony, technically satisfying feudal obligations while keeping him safely beyond his father's reach. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed at Orwell with a small force of mercenaries and English exiles. They came not as conquerors, but as liberators, and England received them as such. The country had endured enough of Edward's misrule, enough of the Despensers' rapacity, enough of governmental breakdown. Town after town opened its gates without resistance. Noble after noble joined the growing rebellion. Edward II and the younger, Despenser, fled westward, seeking refuge in Wales, where the king's father had once built his ring of impregnable castles. But those stone fortresses, symbols of English dominance, could not protect a king who had lost his people's loyalty. At Neath Abbey, royal fugitives became royal prisoners when Henry of Lancaster, Thomas's younger brother, finally cornered the king he had once served faithfully. The younger Despenser died horribly at Hereford, his execution a mirror of Gaveston's, but more savage still. Dragged through the streets, hanged until nearly dead, then disemboweled while crowds cheered, he paid the full price for years of greed and arrogance. His father had already died at Bristol, both Despensers becoming cautionary tales about the perils of overreaching ambition. Edward II abdicated in January 1327, his reign ending not in battle, but in bitter ceremony at Kenilworth Castle. Before, a parliament that included his own son, the broken king renounced his crown and accepted the inevitable. The boy, who would become Edward III, knelt to receive the regalia of kingship. while his father wept for a throne he had never learned to fill. The deposed king's death at Berkeley Castle in September 1327 remained shrouded in mystery and whispered horror. Official records spoke of natural causes, but popular imagination conjured tales of red-hot pokers and screams that echoed through the night. Whether murdered or dying of grief and despair, Edward II passed into history as a warning about the price of weak kingship in an age that demanded strength. Edward III began his reign as a boy king under the shadow of his mother's lover. But the blood of the first Edward ran strong in his veins. As he grew to manhood, watching Mortimer rule England in all but name, the young king's resentment grew like fire fed by wind. In 1330, at Nottingham Castle, that resentment finally blazed into action that would reshape the medieval world. The coup came at midnight, executed with the precision of long planning. Young knights loyal to Edward crept through secret passages beneath Nottingham Castle, emerging like vengeful spirits in Mortimer's very chamber. The Earl of March, caught in bed with the Queen Mother, faced his king's justice at last. His execution at Tyburn ended the rule of favourites forever. No future king would allow a subject such power over the throne. Isabella, the she-wolf who had brought down one king, found herself gently but firmly removed from power by another. Edward III treated his mother with formal respect but political exile, granting her generous estates while ensuring she could never again threaten royal authority. She lived 30 more years in comfortable retirement. Her revolutionary days ended, her place in history secured as the queen who proved that even kings could fall. With Mortimer dead and Isabella neutralized, Edward III finally ruled in his own right, and England felt the difference immediately. Where his father had been weak and vacillating, the young king proved decisive and bold. Where Edward II had alienated his nobles, Edward III bound them to his cause through shared adventure and common purpose. He understood what his father never had, that medieval kingship was theatre as much as governance, requiring a monarch who could inspire as well as command. The new king's first great test came from the north, where Scotland continued to assert its independence under David II, son of Robert Bruce. Edward Balliol, son of the humiliated John Balliol, had been pressing his own claim to the Scottish throne with English support. But the Scots remained loyal to Bruce's dynasty. When David fled to France and Scottish regents prepared for renewed war, Edward III saw opportunity gleaming like gold in northern streams. At Halidon Hill in 1333, the English longbow proved its worth once more, cutting down Scottish spearmen, like wheat before the sickle. The victory seemed to promise easy conquest, but Scotland's genius lay not in pitched battles, but in the harder arts of endurance and irregular warfare. The kingdom that had learned to resist Edward the Fun would not easily bow to Edward III, regardless of tactical defeats. But Edward's attention soon turned toward a greater prize. When Charles IV of France died without male heirs in 1328, the question of succession opened like a door to unlimited ambition. Through his mother Isabella, Edward could claim to be Charles's closest male relative. The French, invoking the Salic law that barred inheritance through female lines, crowned Philip VI of Valois instead. It was a legal distinction that would cost both kingdoms rivers of blood. For 9 years, Edward accepted Philip's kingship while nursing his grievance like a hidden flame. But when Philip supported David II of Scotland and threatened English trade with Flanders, the flame burst into the conflagration that would be known as the 100 Years' War. In 1337, Edward formally claimed the French crown, and two great nations began a struggle that would span generations. The war began fitfully, with raids and counter-raids that settled nothing while bleeding both realms white. Edward's early campaigns in northern France achieved little beyond devastation, while Philip's raids into Gascony gained ground but not decision. Both kings seemed content to fight like merchants, counting costs and calculating profits, until Edward decided to stake everything on one great gamble. In July 1346, Edward landed at Saint-Vaast-la-Hougue with an army that represented England's finest military achievement. 10,000 men, knights, men-at-arms, and above all longbowmen, came ashore in Normandy with conquest burning in their hearts. They came not to raid but to conquer, not to skirmish, but to claim a throne that Edward believed was rightfully his. The march across Normandy became a masterpiece of controlled destruction. Edward's army moved like a plague of steel locusts, consuming everything in its path while maintaining perfect discipline. Towns burned, castles fell, and French resistance crumbled before English efficiency. At Caen, the army captured a prize greater than gold, confirmation that France could be conquered by those brave enough to try. Philip VI finally roused himself to action, gathering the largest army France had ever assembled. Nearly 50,000 men, the flower of French chivalry, supported by Genoese crossbowmen and allied troops from across Europe, converged on the English like an avalanche of steel and silk. Numbers alone should have guaranteed French victory, but Edward had advantages that no French accountant could calculate. At Crécy-en-Ponthieu, on August 26, 1346, those advantages announced themselves with the whisper of arrows and the thunder of falling horses. Edward chose his ground with the care of a master craftsman, positioning his army on a slope that channeled French attacks into killing zones swept by longbow fire. The 16-year-old Black Prince commanded one division, learning the arts of war under the eyes of his father and the witness of history. The battle began with a clash between old and new military technologies. The Genoese crossbowmen, proud mercenaries whose weapons had dominated European battlefields for generations, found themselves outranged and overwhelmed by English longbows. Where they could loose one bolt, the English archers released 5 arrows, and the mathematical certainty of archery mathematics made itself felt in Genoese blood. As the crossbowmen wavered and broke, French chivalry charged with all the fury of frustrated pride. But courage alone could not overcome the revolution in military affairs that England had perfected. Wave after wave of French knights crashed against English positions like ocean swells against granite cliffs, each charge heroic and hopeless, each retreat leaving the field more thickly carpeted with noble dead. King John of Bohemia, blind and ancient but fierce as winter wind, heard the battle's song and demanded to be led into the fight. His knights bound their horses' reins together and charged into the English lines, seeking death with honor rather than life with shame. They found what they sought, and the blind king's ostrich feathers became the Black Prince's badge, carried into future battles as a trophy of chivalric devotion. By nightfall, the flower of French chivalry lay withered on Crécy's slopes. Philip VI, wounded and humiliated, fled toward Amiens, while his kingdom reeled under the magnitude of defeat. Edward had proven that English arms could master French numbers, that tactical innovation could overcome traditional advantage. The balance of European power shifted like sand in a great wind, and England found itself among the continent's premier military powers. The siege of Calais followed Crécy like winter following autumn, methodical and inexorable. For 11 months, Edward's army encircled the French port, building a virtual city outside its walls, creating such a complete blockade that surrender became inevitable. When the gates finally opened in August 1347, 6 burghers walked out in sackcloth and halters, offering their lives for their city's salvation. Only Queen Philippa's intercession saved them from Edward's wrath, but Calais itself became an English possession that would endure for over 2 centuries. Edward's triumph seemed complete, his claim to France validated by victory, his kingdom's prestige elevated beyond all previous heights. English wool funded his campaigns. English longbows won his battles. English determination sustained his ambitions. The boy king who had overthrown Mortimer at Nottingham had become the conqueror who humbled France at Crécy. Yet even as he celebrated victory, forces beyond any king's control prepared to humble victor and vanquished alike. In 1348, ships arrived in English ports carrying more than trade goods from the continent. Hidden in their holds, in the bodies of rats and fleas, travelled death itself, the Black Death that would transform medieval Europe more completely than any army ever could. The plague respected neither crown nor conquest, acknowledging no difference between English victor and French victim. Before its invisible advance, all human ambitions became equal in their fragility. The Great Mortality, as contemporaries called it, swept through England like wildfire through dry grass. Village after village fell silent. Abbey after abbey echoed. Empty field after field returned to wilderness as their cultivators lay beneath freshly turned earth. Perhaps a third of England's population perished in 2 terrible years, leaving the survivors to rebuild civilization from its scattered fragments. Yet from catastrophe came transformation. The survivors, fewer in number, but greater in individual worth, found themselves in a world where labour commanded premium prices and old social certainties crumbled like parchment in flame. Villains demanded wages, craftsmen formed guilds, merchants accumulated fortunes that rivaled noble inheritances. England emerged from the plague years scarred but stronger, its society more flexible, its economy more dynamic than ever before. Edward III lived to see his kingdom transformed, his great victories against France balanced by the greater victory of English resilience against catastrophe. In his later years, as the Black Prince's health failed and French armies recovered their strength, the king, who had seemed destined to conquer Europe, found himself fighting to preserve English gains in France. Yet his true legacy lay not in continental conquests, but in the nation he had forged through shared triumph and common survival. By 1377, the old king's vigour had faded like summer into autumn. The Black Prince, that mirror of chivalric virtue, had died the year before, leaving his 10-year-old son Richard as heir to a throne that had known nothing but glory for 50 years. Edward III passed into eternity on June 21st, 1377, having ruled longer than any English king since Henry III, having transformed his realm from a peripheral kingdom into Europe's premier military power. As bells tolled across England for the king who had given them Crécy and Poitiers, who had weathered the Black Death and emerged victorious, the medieval world prepared for its next great transformation. The boy who would become Richard II knelt to receive the crown his grandfather had worn with such distinction, while noble and commoner alike wondered whether England's golden age had ended or merely paused before achieving new heights. In the lengthening shadows of late afternoon, medieval England held its breath and waited for tomorrow. The great king's strength had waned like autumn light, and when Edward III drew his final breath in 1377, the crown passed not to his eldest son. The Black Prince had preceded his father to the grave, but to a golden-haired boy of 10 summers, Richard of Bordeaux. Thus began one of the most turbulent chapters in England's long tale. As the realm prepared to witness the rise and fall of kings, the thunder of French victories, and the scarlet bloom of civil war that would tear the very heart from the kingdom. Young, Richard II ascended the throne with eyes that held both wonder and wariness. For though he possessed the bearing of royalty, the weight of kingship pressed heavily upon shoulders barely grown. The realm around him seethed with discontent. Taxes levied for endless French wars had bled the common folk dry, while great lords watched with calculating eyes, sensing opportunity in the weakness of minority rule. In these early years, England felt the tremors of change stirring beneath the surface like underground waters seeking release. The old feudal bonds that had held society together for 3 centuries were loosening, strained by plague, war, and the growing awareness among the common people that their labour held value beyond what lords would acknowledge. In manor houses and market squares, whispers of discontent grew louder with each passing season. The boy king's court glittered with ceremony and pageantry, yet beneath the silken surface lay currents of ambition and resentment. His uncles, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, and Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, wielded power as regents, their own designs often at odds with each other and with the kingdom's needs. Richard watched and learned, his young mind absorbing lessons in power and its perils that would shape his troubled reign. The great castles that had stood as symbols of Norman strength now housed courts where intrigue flowed like wine, where whispered conversations in shadowed alcoves could topple ministers and reshape the kingdom's destiny. Richard's court became a place of beauty and danger, where poets and philosophers mingled with ambitious nobles, and where the young king began to develop the tastes and temperament that would ultimately seal his fate. As the king grew from boy to youth, England itself was transforming. The old certainties of medieval life, the unquestioned authority of lords, the acceptance of one's station, the belief that God had ordained the social order, began to crack like winter ice in spring's warmth. New ideas stirred in monastery schools and guild halls, carried by wandering friars and travelling merchants who had seen other ways of living beyond England's shores. In the summer of 1381, the accumulated grievances of generations erupted in a fury that shook the kingdom to its foundations. The peasants' revolt began as whispers of resistance in the villages of Essex and Kent, but like wildfire in dry grain, it spread across the southeastern counties with devastating speed. The immediate cause was the poll tax, a levy that fell equally upon rich and poor, but the deeper roots lay in decades of social and economic upheaval. Wat Tyler emerged from obscurity to lead the rebels, his name becoming a rallying cry for the dispossessed and downtrodden. Beside him stood John Ball, the radical priest whose sermons had long planted seeds of equality in fertile minds. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? This simple question, posed in village churches and market squares, challenged the very foundations upon which medieval society rested. The rebels marched on London with righteous fury burning in their hearts, their ranks swelling as they passed through countryside and village. They bore crude weapons, scythes and billhooks, clubs and rusty swords. But their greatest weapon was their unity of purpose. Lords who had ruled unchallenged for centuries suddenly found their authority questioned by those they had deemed their natural inferiors. London's gates opened before the rebel host, and for a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed as though the entire social order might be swept away. The Tower of London, that ancient symbol of royal power, fell to the rebels' assault. Within its walls, they found the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Treasurer, both symbols of the authority they despised, and both paid with their lives for centuries of oppression. Young Richard, barely 14 years old, faced his first great crisis with a courage that surprised his enemies and heartened his supporters. At Smithfield, he rode out to meet the rebels personally, his small figure dwarfed by the angry multitude surrounding him. When Wat Tyler approached the king's horse, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a blade. The confrontation at Smithfield became legend, though the truth remains shrouded in the mists of conflicting accounts. Tyler fell, struck down by the mayor's sword in a moment of violence that could have ignited a massacre. Instead, young Richard seized the moment with instincts beyond his years, crying out to the crowd, "I will be your king, I will be your captain, and your leader." His words, whether born of genuine conviction or desperate necessity, calmed the storm and sent the rebels dispersing to their homes. Yet the promises made in that moment of crisis were soon forgotten. The boy king who had shown such courage in facing the rebels proved less steadfast in honouring his commitments. The pardons were revoked, the reforms abandoned, and many who had trusted in royal mercy found themselves swinging from gallows across the countryside. England returned to its old ways, but the memory of those few days when the world turned upside down lingered in the collective consciousness like smoke from a distant fire. As Richard matured from youth to man, two distinct aspects of his character emerged, often at war with one another. The public Richard was a king of refined tastes and artistic sensibility, a patron of poets like Geoffrey Chaucer, and a creator of court ceremonies that rivaled those of France in their splendour. His court became a centre of cultural refinement, where troubadours sang of courtly love and scholars debated the finer points of theology and philosophy. This Richard appreciated beauty in all its forms: magnificent tapestries, illuminated manuscripts, the latest fashions from the continent. He understood that kingship was partly spectacle, that the common people needed to see their monarch surrounded by the trappings of divine authority. His royal progresses through the countryside were carefully orchestrated displays of majesty, designed to remind his subjects of the gulf that separated crowned heads from common folk. But beneath this cultured exterior lay another Richard, one marked by deep insecurities and a paranoid suspicion of those around him. The trauma of his youth, ascending the throne as a child, facing rebellion, navigating the treacherous currents of court politics, had left its mark. He trusted few and forgave fewer, maintaining lists of grievances that grew longer with each passing year. This darker aspect of the king's nature began to dominate as his reign progressed. Where once he had been content to work within the traditional bounds of royal authority, he increasingly chafed against any limits on his power. The great nobles who had guided his youth became obstacles to be overcome rather than counsellors to be heeded. Parliament, that growing institution which had served his predecessors as a source of funds and advice, became an irritating constraint on his will. Richard's marriage to Anne of Bohemia had brought him genuine happiness, and her death in 1394 plunged him into a grief that seemed to unlock all his latent instabilities. The king who had once shown mercy to rebels now proved utterly ruthless toward those he perceived as enemies. His inner circle grew smaller and more isolated from the broader currents of English political life, creating a dangerous disconnect between royal will and national interest. The crisis that would ultimately destroy Richard began with a quarrel that seemed almost trivial, a dispute between Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford and son of John of Gaunt, and Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk. What started as accusations of treason between two nobles escalated into a confrontation that would reshape the English throne. Richard's handling of this dispute revealed the extent to which suspicion and fear had corrupted his judgment. Rather than allow the traditional trial by combat to proceed, Richard intervened at the last moment, banishing both men from the realm. This decision, seemingly judicious, actually revealed his deep distrust of the great nobles and his desire to remove potential threats before they could mature. When John of Gaunt died in 1399, Richard seized his vast Lancastrian estates, denying Henry Bolingbroke his rightful inheritance, a violation of feudal law that sent shockwaves through the nobility. Henry Bolingbroke landed at Ravenspur in Yorkshire in July 1399, claiming he had returned only to reclaim his stolen inheritance. Yet the small force that accompanied him from his French exile grew like a rolling snowball as it moved south, gathering to its banner lords and knights who had grown weary of Richard's arbitrary rule. What began as a quest for justice became something far greater, a challenge to the throne itself. Richard's absence in Ireland, attempting to subdue rebellious lords there, proved fatal to his cause. By the time he returned to Welsh shores, his kingdom had already slipped from his grasp like sand through outstretched fingers. The speed of his collapse testified not to Henry's skill alone, but to the depth of discontent that Richard's later policies had generated among the very class upon which royal power ultimately depended. The meeting between the two cousins at Flint Castle was heavy with unspoken understanding. Richard, still bearing the outward dignity of kingship, knew that his reign was ending. Henry, claiming still to seek only his rightful inheritance, understood that he was crossing a line from which there could be no return. The conversation between them, conducted with the elaborate courtesy that medieval nobility had perfected as a mask for deadly intent, marked the moment when one dynasty died and another was born. Richard's deposition was conducted with careful attention to legal forms, for Henry understood that his claim to the throne rested on shaky foundations. Unlike his predecessors, who had inherited by clear right of blood, Henry was a usurper, however justified his actions might seem. The ceremony in Westminster Hall, where Richard formally renounced his crown, was designed to give legitimacy to what was essentially a seizure of power. The question of what to do with the deposed king haunted Henry's early reign like a spectre at a feast. Richard alive remained a focus for potential rebellion, a legitimate claimant around whom discontented nobles might rally. Richard dead would make Henry a regicide, with all the moral and political complications that such a deed entailed, the solution came with characteristic medieval ambiguity. Richard died in captivity at Pontefract Castle, officially of melancholy, though whispers of murder followed Henry to his grave. Henry IV, as he now styled himself, faced the enormous challenge of establishing a new dynasty's legitimacy, while managing the practical problems of governing a realm that had grown accustomed to questioning royal authority. The very success of his rebellion against Richard demonstrated that English kings could be overthrown, a precedent that would haunt the Lancastrian line for generations to come. The early years of Henry's reign were marked by almost constant rebellion, as various claimants and malcontents tested the new king's resolve. The Welsh, led by the charismatic Owain Glyndwr, rose in revolt that lasted for over a decade. In the north, the Percy family, who had helped Henry to the throne, turned against their former ally when he proved less generous than they had expected. Each rebellion, though ultimately unsuccessful, drained the royal treasury and reminded all observers that the crown sat uneasily on the usurper's head. From the crucible of his father's troubled reign emerged a prince who would become the embodiment of medieval English martial glory. Henry of Monmouth, the future Henry V, learned statecraft in the harsh school of Welsh warfare, where Owain Glyndwr's guerrilla tactics taught him lessons that no court tutor could provide. The young prince's experiences in the Welsh marches, fighting an enemy who refused to meet him in pitched battle, forged him into a commander of exceptional skill and adaptability. While still in his teens, Prince Henry bore responsibilities that would have crushed lesser men. His father's mysterious illness, some whispered it was leprosy, others claimed divine punishment for Richard's murder, left much of the practical governance in the prince's capable hands. Court observers noted the transformation from wild youth to serious statesman, though they could hardly have predicted the heights to which his ambitions would ultimately soar. The prince's relationship with his father was complex, marked by periods of cooperation and tension that reflected the broader challenges facing the Lancastrian dynasty. Henry IV's suspicious nature, born of his precarious position, sometimes extended even to his heir, while the prince's growing confidence occasionally chafed against paternal authority. Yet beneath these surface tensions lay a shared understanding of the dynasty's vulnerability and the need to establish its legitimacy through success. When Henry IV died in 1413, worn down by years of constant struggle and mysterious ailment, his son inherited more than a crown. He received a mission to prove that the Lancastrian seizure of power had been divinely blessed. The new Henry V understood instinctively that military glory offered the surest path to dynastic legitimacy, and his gaze turned naturally toward France, where English claims dating back to Edward III provided perfect justification for renewed warfare. The France that beckoned to Henry's ambitions was a realm torn by civil war between Armagnacs and Burgundians, factions whose mutual hatred had paralyzed effective government and left the kingdom vulnerable to foreign intervention. Henry's careful diplomatic preparations revealed a strategic mind of the First Order, as he skillfully played the French factions against each other while building a coalition of support for his enterprise. The invasion fleet that assembled in the summer of 1415 represented the culmination of months of meticulous planning. Henry had learned from the failures of earlier expeditions, ensuring adequate supplies, proper equipment, and, most crucially, sufficient funds to sustain a lengthy campaign. The army that crossed the Channel was smaller than Edward III's great hosts, but far more professional, a reflection of the military evolution that had transformed European warfare over the previous century. The siege of Harfleur tested both Henry's tactical skills and his army's resilience. The port town's strong fortifications and determined defenders turned what Henry had hoped would be a quick victory into a grinding attritional struggle that consumed precious time and men. Disease, that eternal enemy of medieval armies, struck with devastating effect, reducing Henry's force to perhaps half its original strength by the time the town finally surrendered. Faced with a weakened army and the approaching end of the campaigning season, Henry confronted a decision that would define his reign and his place in history. The safe course would have been to embark his remaining forces and return to England, claiming Harfleur as sufficient success for the year's efforts. Instead, Henry chose to march across Normandy to Calais, a decision that seemed to court disaster, but ultimately led to immortal glory. On St. Crispin's Day, October 25, 1415, the muddy fields near the village of Agincourt became the stage for one of the most celebrated victories in English military history. The French army that blocked Henry's path to Calais was everything that medieval warfare prized: massive, magnificently equipped, and filled with the flower of French nobility. Against this glittering host stood Henry's small, sick and exhausted force, outnumbered by at least 3-1, yet burning with desperate determination. The night before the battle passed with ominous quiet, broken only by the sounds of men, preparing for what many believed would be their final dawn. Henry moved among his soldiers in the pre-battle darkness, his presence a source of comfort to men who faced overwhelming odds. The king who would become legend understood that battles were won not merely by tactics and weapons, but by the spirit of those who wielded them. When morning came, grey and drizzling, the two armies faced each other across a narrow field bounded by woods on either side. The French, confident in their numbers and the righteousness of their cause, waited for the English to make the first move. Henry, understanding that his position would only worsen with delay, ordered his archers forward to provoke the engagement that would determine the fate of two kingdoms. The English longbowmen, descendants of those who had won glory at Crécy and Poitiers, drew their war bows with practiced ease. The cloth-yard shafts they loosed darkened the sky like a lethal cloud, falling among the French ranks with devastating effect. Yet it was not the arrows alone that won the day, but the combination of English tactical innovation with French tactical inflexibility that turned Agincourt into catastrophe for one side and miracle for the other. The French cavalry, advancing through mud that clutched at hooves and boots alike, found their charge slowing to a laborious trudge under the constant rain of arrows. Those who reached the English lines discovered that Henry had positioned his men-at-arms between stakes driven into the ground, creating a defensive barrier that channeled the French attack into killing zones where English weapons could work. Their deadly harvest. What followed was less a battle than a systematic destruction of French military power. The cream of French nobility, encumbered by heavy armour that became a liability in the sucking mud, fell victim to English archers and men-at-arms who showed no mercy to enemies who had threatened to cut off their fingers. The field became a charnel house, where the proudest names of France lay humbled in the mire. Henry's order to kill the French prisoners remains one of the most controversial aspects of the battle, a decision that violated the chivalric codes of the age, yet demonstrated the king's ruthless pragmatism. Faced with the possibility of renewed French attacks while encumbered by numerous captives, Henry chose military necessity over knightly honour, a choice that saved his army but stained his reputation among those who valued medieval ideals above practical success. The victory at Agincourt transformed Henry from a usurper's son into a king blessed by divine favour. News of the triumph electrified England, where the population erupted in celebrations that lasted for weeks. The captured French nobles who accompanied Henry back to England served as living proof of English martial superiority, while the ransom they represented helped refill the royal treasury that constant warfare had drained. Agincourt was merely the beginning of Henry's systematic conquest of northern France, a campaign that combined military brilliance with political acumen in ways that his predecessors had never achieved. The king who returned to England as a hero understood that his victory, however glorious, would prove ephemeral unless followed by sustained effort to secure permanent English control over French territory. The second invasion of France in 1417 revealed Henry at the height of his powers, leading an army that had learned from its earlier experiences and facing an enemy further weakened by internal divisions. The systematic reduction of Norman strongholds demonstrated English improvements in siege warfare, while Henry's careful treatment of civilian populations showed his understanding that conquest required winning hearts as well as battles. The siege of Rouen lasting from July 1418 to January 1419, became the centerpiece of Henry's conquest, a demonstration of English determination that shocked France and Europe. The city's desperate resistance, followed by its inevitable surrender, marked the effective end of French control over Normandy and established Henry as the dominant power in northern France. Yet even as English arms triumphed in the field, Henry pursued diplomatic solutions that would give legal foundation to his conquests. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 represented the pinnacle of his achievement, formally recognizing him as heir to the French throne and regent during the lifetime of the Mad King Charles VI. His marriage to Catherine of Valois, daughter of the French king, sealed the agreement with dynastic bonds that seemed to promise lasting peace. The dual monarchy that Henry created existed more on parchment than in reality, for his control extended only to those areas his armies had conquered. The Dauphin Charles, disinherited by the Treaty of Troyes, maintained his own court south of the Loire, while much of central France remained contested territory where English and French forces skirmished endlessly for control of castles and towns. Henry's final years were spent in the grinding work of consolidation, trying to transform military conquest into stable government. The administrative challenge of ruling two kingdoms while maintaining armies in the field stretched even his exceptional abilities, while the financial burden of constant warfare drained both English and conquered French resources. When dysentery struck Henry down at Vincennes in August 1422, he was only 35 years old, cut down at the height of his powers before he could complete the transformation of his conquests into lasting empire. His death marked not only the end of an extraordinary individual reign, but the beginning of the long decline that would ultimately cost England all its French possessions. The infant who inherited Henry's dual crown faced challenges that would have tested the greatest rulers in history. Henry VI, barely 9 months old when his father died, became King of England and nominal King of France at an age when most children are learning to walk. The regency that governed in his name faced the impossible task of maintaining conquests that had required Henry V's personal genius to achieve. The minority of Henry VI's marked the beginning of England's long retreat from the continental empire that 3 Edwards and Henry V had built through 2 centuries of warfare. The Regency Council, dominated by the king's uncles, John, Duke of Bedford, and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, struggled to maintain unity of purpose while pursuing increasingly divergent policies in France and England. Bedford, the ablest of Henry V's brothers, understood better than most the fragility of English rule in France. His efforts to maintain the dual monarchy through careful diplomacy and selective military action showed genuine strategic insight, but he lacked the resources and the charismatic authority that had made his brother's conquests possible. The burden of defending vast territories with limited manpower and dwindling financial support proved increasingly impossible. In England, Gloucester's ambitions and his feud with Cardinal Henry Beaufort created divisions that weakened the regency's effectiveness. The Duke's romantic pursuit of Jacqueline of Hainaut, while politically disastrous, revealed the extent to which personal interests could override national policy in an age when the distinction between private and public spheres remained unclear. Appearance of Joan of Arc in 1429 marked a turning point that English commanders were slow to recognize. This peasant girl's claim to divine mission struck at something deeper than military strategy. She offered the French a narrative of national liberation that transformed their struggle from feudal dispute into holy war. Her relief of Orléans and the subsequent coronation of Charles VII at Reims dealt devastating blows to English prestige and morale. Joan's capture and execution in 1431 provided temporary relief for English forces, but ultimately backfired as propaganda. The spectacle of English authorities burning a young woman who claimed divine inspiration created a powerful martyr narrative that French propagandists exploited effectively. The political benefits of eliminating a dangerous enemy were far outweighed by the moral costs of appearing to make war against heaven itself. As Henry VI grew from child to youth, it became increasingly apparent that he had inherited none of his father's martial abilities or political instincts. Gentle, Pious and scholarly by nature, the young king showed more interest in founding colleges than in recovering his French inheritance. His personality, while admirable in many respects, proved catastrophically unsuited to the demands of medieval kingship. The Congress of Arras in 1435 marked England's diplomatic isolation, as their Burgundian allies abandoned the English cause in favour of reconciliation with France. This betrayal, though long anticipated by astute observers, effectively ended any realistic hope of maintaining the dual monarchy. Without Burgundian support, English forces in France became isolated garrisons in an increasingly hostile land. Henry's marriage to Margaret of Anjou in 1445 was intended to bring peace through diplomacy, but instead brought new complications to an already troubled realm. The young queen's strong personality and political ambitions created factional conflicts at court, while the territorial concessions made to secure the marriage further weakened English positions in France. The final collapse of English power in France came with stunning swiftness once it began. The French, now united under competent leadership and equipped with effective artillery, systematically reduced English strongholds throughout Normandy and Gascony. Towns that had flown English banners for decades surrendered with barely a show of resistance, their populations eager to be rid of foreign occupiers. By 1453, English rule in France had shrunk to the single port of Calais, all that remained of an empire that had once stretched from the Channel to the Pyrenees. The 100 Years' War, that great conflict that had defined Anglo-French relations for over a century, ended not with a treaty, but with a whimper, as the last English garrisons sailed home from conquered territories that had reverted to French control. The loss of France created a crisis of confidence that struck at the very foundations of Lancastrian rule. Henry VI, whose grandfather had usurped the throne and whose father had won glory through conquest, now presided over the most humiliating military defeat in English history. The noble families who had supported the dynasty through its early struggles began to question whether God still favoured the House of Lancaster. Into this vacuum of authority stepped Richard, Duke of York, whose bloodline carried claims that predated Henry IV's usurpation. Through his mother, Anne Mortimer, Richard could trace his descent to Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, Edward III's second son, while the Lancastrians descended from John of Gaunt, the third son. This distinction, arcane though it might seem, provided the legal foundation for challenging Lancastrian legitimacy. York's initial opposition to Henry VI focused on practical governance rather than dynastic claims. As the king's mental health deteriorated, Henry suffered episodes of complete incapacity that left him unable to recognize even his closest companions. York positioned himself as the natural choice to serve as protector of the realm. His administrative competence and military experience in France made him a logical candidate for such responsibility. Queen Margaret's fierce opposition to York's growing influence transformed what might have remained a struggle over regency into something far more dangerous. Her determination to preserve her son's inheritance and her husband's dignity, while politically understandable, hardened factional divisions into irreconcilable hostilities. The court split between those who supported the Queen's party and those who backed York's claims to authority. The birth of Prince Edward in 1453 should have strengthened the Lancastrian dynasty by providing a male heir, but instead it created new complications. York's supporters whispered that the child could not be Henry's, given the king's mental condition, while Margaret's faction saw York's reluctance to accept the prince's legitimacy as proof of treasonous ambitions. Trust, once broken, proved impossible to restore. The First Battle of St. Albans in 1455 began as a confrontation over access to the king, rather than a fight for the crown itself. York and his allies, particularly Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, sought to remove Henry from the influence of councillors they deemed corrupt and incompetent. When negotiations failed, swords replaced words, and English blood was spilled in a domestic quarrel for the first time in generations. The battle itself was brief and decisive, with York's forces achieving rapid victory through superior tactics and positioning. The deaths of Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and other leading Lancastrian nobles created feuds that would persist through generations, as their heirs inherited not only titles and lands, but also obligations to avenge their fathers' deaths. Henry's capture at St. Albans placed him under York's control, but rather than press his advantage to its logical conclusion, York chose to maintain the fiction of loyal service to the crown. This decision, motivated perhaps by genuine respect for kingship or by recognition that the realm was not ready for another usurpation, allowed Margaret to regroup her forces and plan her counterattack. The period between 1455 and 1459 saw an uneasy peace maintained through mutual exhaustion rather than genuine reconciliation. Both sides built their strength, secured their positions, and waited for the moment when decisive action might tip the balance permanently in their favour. The court resembled an armed camp, where men wore mail beneath their robes and every feast might be their last. When fighting resumed in 1459, it did so with increased bitterness and desperation. The Battle of Blore Heath saw Margaret's forces defeated by a smaller Yorkist army, while the rout of Ludford Bridge forced York and his supporters into temporary exile. These rapid reversals of fortune demonstrated the precarious nature of military advantage in civil war conditions. York's return from Ireland in 1460, accompanied by Warwick and other exiled lords, marked the beginning of the final phase of the struggle for supremacy. The Battle of Northampton delivered Henry VI once again into Yorkist hands, while York's formal claim to the throne in Parliament transformed the conflict from a struggle over government into an open contest for the crown itself. The roses of York and Lancaster, white and red, had begun their deadly dance, and medieval England would never be the same. The throne of England with a legitimacy that wars could not fully grant, for crowns won by the sword must forever be defended by it. The white rose of York had bloomed in victory, yet beneath its petals lay the seeds of further strife, the eternal cycle of medieval kingship, where power and paranoia walked hand in hand through the corridors of Westminster. Edward IV rose like the sun after storm, his reign beginning with the promise of peace after decades of civil discord. Tall and commanding, blessed with the golden charisma that made men follow and women adore, he seemed the very embodiment of kingship that England had long awaited. His court glittered with the wealth of recovered trade, the coffers filled not through crushing taxation, but through the careful cultivation of commerce and the wise management of royal lands. The new king's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville in 1464 sent ripples through the realm like stones cast into still water. She was beautiful beyond measure, a widow whose silver gold hair caught the light like spun moonbeams, yet her elevation from minor nobility to queen consort struck the great lords as a breach of natural order. The Nevilles, who had raised Edward to his throne, watched with growing unease as the Woodvilles multiplied in influence, their children marrying into the highest families, their ambitions growing like ivy across the walls of power. Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, had been called the Kingmaker, and in his pride lay the seeds of his own destruction. Having made one king, he believed he could unmake him with equal ease. The quarrel began as whispers in private chambers, grew into open disagreement in council, and finally blazed into armed rebellion. Warwick's attempt to restore Henry VI to the throne in 1470 sent Edward fleeing across the North Sea to Burgundy, where he found refuge with his sister Margaret, now Duchess of Burgundy, whose husband's ships and gold would prove the instruments of restoration. The exile lasted mere months, but in that brief span, Edward learned lessons that would shape his second reign. He returned not as the careless young victor of Towton, but as a king who understood that mercy must sometimes wear the mask of severity. The battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury in 1471 crushed the Lancastrian cause with such finality that even hope seemed to perish in the mud-soaked fields. Prince Edward, son of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, fell at Tewkesbury, his death marking the end of the direct Lancastrian line. In the Tower of London, Henry VI met his end on a May night in 1471. The saintly king, who had reigned for 39 troubled years, finally released from earthly cares. Official records spoke of melancholy and divine providence, yet the realm whispered of more earthly interventions, of Richard of Gloucester's midnight visit to the Tower, of the necessity that kings must sometimes embrace to secure their brothers' thrones. The second reign of Edward IV unfolded like a tapestry, woven in gold and crimson, its pattern displaying the heights that medieval kingship could achieve when blessed with victory, wealth, and time. The king's court became renowned throughout Europe for its magnificence, where Italian silks rustled against Flemish tapestries, where the finest musicians played beneath painted ceilings that rivaled those of Italian palaces. Edward's patronage of William Caxton brought the printing press to England, those metal letters marching across paper like tiny soldiers conquering ignorance and spreading knowledge across the realm. Yet beneath the splendor, shadows gathered like storm clouds on distant horizons. The king's appetites were legendary, for food, for wine, for women whose beauty caught his wandering eye. His body, once magnificent in its strength, began to thicken with indulgence, the Golden Prince becoming a corpulent king whose breathing grew laboured with the effort of carrying his own magnificence. The Clarence crisis of 1478 revealed the darker currents flowing beneath the surface of Yorkist triumph. George, Duke of Clarence, Edward's own brother, had inherited the family talent for kingship, but not its wisdom. His involvement in plots, his marriage to Warwick's daughter against royal wishes, his persistent claims that Edward's marriage was invalid and his children illegitimate, finally pushed the king beyond the boundaries of fraternal tolerance. The execution of Clarence by drowning in a butt of Malmsey wine became one of the darker legends of the age, a death so bizarre that later generations would debate whether it was punishment, mercy, or mere invention. Yet in the cold chambers of power, the message was clear. Not even royal blood could protect those who threatened the stability of the realm. The king had learned that mercy shown to rebels was often cruelty shown to the innocent who would suffer in future rebellions. As the 1470s gave way to the 1480s, Edward's reign seemed to have achieved the impossible. A England united under York, prosperous in trade, respected in Europe, and blessed with two young princes who would carry the white rose into future generations. The court celebrated the marriages of royal children, watched the construction of magnificent chapels, and enjoyed the fruits of peace that had been purchased with so much blood at Towton and Tewkesbury. Yet in the shadows of Westminster and the Tower, other watchers observed and planned. Richard of Gloucester, the king's youngest brother, had served with unwavering loyalty through every crisis, earning lands and titles in the north, where his justice was respected and his name honoured. But Richard was a man of the medieval world, where loyalty to persons competed with loyalty to dynasties, where the good of the realm might demand actions that would stain the soul with guilt that no amount of prayer could wash clean. April 9th, 1483, dawned grey and cold over Westminster, carrying in its chill winds the scent of change that would transform England forever. Edward IV, the Golden King who had seemed destined to rule for decades more, lay dead at the age of 40, his great body finally succumbing to the accumulated burden of his appetites and the mysterious illness that had consumed him through the long Lenten weeks. The realm held its breath as news spread along the ancient roads, carried by riders whose horses' hooves drummed out the rhythm of impending crisis. In Ludlow Castle, 12-year-old Edward IV received the news that made him King of England, his young face pale beneath the golden hair inherited from his father. Around him gathered the Woodvilles, his mother's family, their eyes bright with the prospect of power during a long minority, their hands already reaching for the levers of government that would make them the true rulers of England. But in Middleham Castle, far to the north where the Yorkshire moors stretched like a green sea towards Scotland, Richard of Gloucester heard the news with different ears. The faithful brother, the loyal duke who had never faltered in his service to the crown, now faced the terrible burden of his oath as protector of the realm. The late king's will had named him guardian of the young prince and regent during his minority Yet already the Woodvilles moved to circumvent this arrangement, to bring the new king to London surrounded by their own armed men, to exclude the Lord Protector from the coronation they planned for early May. The interception of the royal party at Stony Stratford on April 30th changed everything, though those present could not have foreseen how completely. Richard's seizure of his nephews, for the young Duke of York had joined his brother in what they believed to be protective custody, seemed at first merely a political manoeuvre, the assertion of rights granted by law and royal will against the grasping ambitions of the Queen's family. The young kings were installed in the Tower of London, not as prisoners, but as royal residents in what had been, for centuries, the traditional lodging for monarchs before their coronations. The ancient fortress by the Thames had witnessed the preparation of countless kings for their sacred anointing, its chambers echoing with the prayers and preparations that preceded the most solemn ceremony in Christendom. The princes played in gardens where other royal children had run, their laughter carrying across courtyards that had heard the footsteps of Plantagenet princes for 300 years. Yet in the council chambers of Westminster, darker currents swirled around the question of legitimacy that would determine not just the succession, but the very nature of kingship itself. Dr. Ralph Shah, preaching at Paul's Cross on June 22nd, proclaimed to a stunned crowd that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, tainted by a prior contract with Eleanor Butler that made all their children bastards, unable to inherit the crown that was the birthright of legitimate blood alone. The revelation struck London like lightning illuminating a stormy sky, revealing landscape transformed beyond recognition. If the princes were indeed illegitimate, then the crown belonged by right to their uncle Richard, the only remaining son of Richard, Duke of York, the only prince whose blood ran pure and untainted through the channels of lawful marriage and legitimate birth. Parliament's declaration of Richard's right to the throne on June 25, 1483, followed ancient precedent and constitutional law, yet it carried within it the seeds of dynasties yet unborn and tragedies that would echo through the centuries. The Duke of Gloucester became Richard III, not through conquest or usurpation, but through the application of laws that had governed English succession since the Norman kings first established the principle that only legitimate heirs could wear the crown of England. The coronation of July 6th blazed with all the ancient splendour that the realm could muster. The new king and his queen Anne Neville walking beneath cloth of gold, while the great bells of Westminster Abbey rang out their triumphant peals. Richard wore the crown of Edward the Confessor with the dignity of a man born to rule, his slight frame given majesty by the sacred oils that transformed mortal flesh into the living embodiment of divine authority on earth. Yet even as the trumpets sounded and the nobles knelt in homage, whispers began to circulate through the courts and taverns of London, like smoke seeping through closed doors. The princes in the Tower had been seen less frequently at their windows. Their games in the gardens had grown quieter, and then, as summer deepened into the golden warmth of August, they were seen no more at all. What happened to Edward V and Richard of York in those summer weeks of 1483 remains one of history's most haunting mysteries, a silence that has echoed through 5 centuries of speculation and investigation. The official records speak of natural death, of weakness inherited from their father's blood, of the divine providence that sometimes removes obstacles to peace and stability. The whispered rumours told darker tales of smothering pillows in midnight chambers, of children's voices calling for help that never came, of burial in unmarked graves beneath the tower's ancient stones. Richard III began his reign with actions that spoke to his vision of kingship as service to the realm rather than exploitation of its resources. His single parliament, meeting in early 1484, passed more beneficial legislation than many kings achieved in decades of rule. The establishment of bail for accused felons, the prohibition of forced loans that had impoverished merchants and craftsmen, the extension of legal protections to all subjects regardless of their station. These measures revealed a king who understood that true authority rested on justice rather than fear. In the north, where Richard had governed as Duke of Gloucester, his policies had already demonstrated this philosophy in action. The Council of the North, his creation, brought royal justice to regions that had previously known only the arbitrary rule of local magnates. His foundation of chantries and colleges, his patronage of learning and piety, his fair dealing with merchants and craftsmen had earned him a loyalty that would endure even unto death. Yet the very thoroughness of Richard's governmental reforms seemed to confirm the whispers that he intended to rule not as a temporary regent, but as a permanent king. The establishment of his son Edward as Prince of Wales, the creation of a royal progress through his realm that would demonstrate the reality of his authority, the careful placement of trusted men in key positions throughout the kingdom, all suggested a king settling in for a long reign, not a protector preparing to yield power to his rightful sovereign. The death of Prince Edward in April 1484 struck Richard like a physical blow, the loss of his only legitimate son shattering not only his personal happiness, but the dynastic future he had envisioned for the House of York. The boy's burial at Sheriff Hutton, beneath skies grey with the promise of rain, marked more than the end of a young life. It marked the beginning of the end for the king, who had staked everything on the gamble that might makes right when right is unclear. Across the narrow seas in Brittany, Henry Tudor waited with the patience of a man who had learned that survival depended on choosing the right moment to act. The last hope of Lancaster carried little of the charisma that had marked previous claimants to the throne, yet in his veins flowed the blood of ancient Welsh princes, of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford, of the Beauforts who had been legitimised by royal decree but forever barred from the succession by parliamentary statute. The coalition that gathered around Henry's exile court represented the exhausted discontent of a realm grown weary of uncertainty. Yorkists disgusted by Richard's alleged crimes joined with Lancastrians seeking restoration, while ambitious nobles saw opportunity in the chaos that seemed to follow the crown like a curse. John Morton, the exiled Bishop of Ely, wove networks of conspiracy that stretched from Breton castles to English manor houses, his letters carrying promises and threats in equal measure. The first invasion attempt in autumn 1483 foundered on the Ytre rocks of weather and betrayal, Henry's ships scattered by Channel storms, while the Duke of Buckingham's rebellion collapsed in the Welsh reign. Buckingham's execution on November 2nd marked the failure of the first serious challenge to Richard's reign. Yet it also demonstrated the fragility of loyalty in an age where kings could fall as quickly as they rose. Through the long months of 1484, Henry's position seemed hopeless, his tiny court of exiles subsisting on Breton charity, while Richard consolidated his power in England. The king's royal progress through the realm had been a triumph, the northern counties greeting their former duke with genuine enthusiasm, while even the southern shires acknowledged his authority. The establishment of the College of Arms, the patronage of scholars and artists, the careful attention to the details of governance, all suggested a reign that might endure for decades. Yet beneath this surface stability, currents of unrest continued to flow. The mystery of the princes haunted Richard's reign like a ghost that could neither be acknowledged nor exorcised. Every attempt to celebrate his kingship was shadowed by the absent princes, whose rightful claims could not be entirely forgotten. The elaborate ceremonies, the magnificent progresses, the careful distribution of lands and titles, all seemed designed to distract attention from the central question that no amount of pageantry could answer. The death of Queen Anne Neville in March 1485 removed another pillar supporting Richard's throne, her quiet passing at Westminster, ending not only a marriage that had brought him the mighty Warwick inheritance, but also the last hope of producing another heir to secure the Yorkist succession. The rumours that the king contemplated marriage to his niece Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV and potential claimant in her own right, scandalised even those accustomed to the calculated marriages of medieval royalty. Henry Tudor's moment came with the turning of the seasons towards summer. His preparations supported by French gold and blessed by papal approval that transformed a dynastic gamble into something approaching a crusade. The papal bull declaring Richard a usurper and tyrant gave Henry's cause the legitimacy of religious sanction, while promises of marriage to Elizabeth of York offered the prospect of uniting the warring roses in bonds stronger than political alliance. The invasion fleet that sailed from Harfleur in August 1485 carried fewer than 3,000 men, yet they bore with them the hopes of all who yearned for an end to the uncertainty that had plagued England since the death of Edward IV. Henry's banner displayed the red dragon of Cadwallader, the ancient symbol of Welsh kingship that proclaimed his intention to restore the island of Britain to its rightful rulers, to heal the wounds inflicted by centuries of Norman and Plantagenet domination. The landing at Mill Bay in Pembrokeshire on August 7th brought Henry home to the Welsh soil that had nurtured his family's ancient dreams of restoration. As his small army marched northeast through the valleys and hills of Wales, it grew like a river fed by tributaries, each settlement adding men who saw in the Red Dragon banner the promise of liberation from foreign rule. Richard received news of the invasion at Nottingham Castle, where he had established his court in the heart of England, equidistant from all potential threats. The king's response revealed both his military skill and his political isolation. He could muster a powerful army, but he could not be certain of its loyalty when the moment of crisis came. Too many nobles held back, their responses to his summons equivocal, their commitment to his cause qualified by considerations of personal interest. The royal army that marched south from Nottingham in late August numbered perhaps 8,000 men, twice the size of Henry's force. Yet Richard knew that numbers alone would not determine the outcome. The Stanleys, Lords Thomas and William, commanded forces larger than either royal army, yet their allegiance remained deliberately ambiguous despite family ties that should have bound them to both claimants. Thomas had married Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort, while William had received honours and lands from Richard's hands. As the armies converged on the Leicestershire countryside in the third week of August, the very landscape seemed to hold its breath, sensing that the approaching battle would determine not merely which king would rule England, but which vision of kingship would prevail. Richard represented the medieval ideal of personal monarchy, where the king's will was law and his authority derived from divine sanction and military prowess. Henry embodied a newer concept of limited monarchy, where the king's power would be constrained by parliamentary consent and administrative efficiency. The night of August 21st passed quietly in both camps, the soldiers sleeping beneath stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms since time began. In his tent, Richard III spent the hours in prayer and preparation, his confessor later reporting that the king spoke not of personal fears, but of his duty to defend the realm against foreign invasion. Henry Tudor's rest was equally fitful, the weight of dynastic responsibility heavy upon shoulders that had never before borne the burden of commanding men in battle. Dawn on August 22nd, 1485, broke grey and misty over the Leicestershire countryside, the summer light struggling through clouds that seemed to mirror the uncertainty hanging over England's future. Near the village of Market Bosworth, three armies faced each other across fields that would soon become the most famous battlefield in English history, the place where the medieval age would meet its end in the clash of steel and the dreams of ambitious men. Richard III arrayed his forces on Ambion Hill, the elevated position giving his commanders a clear view of the approaching enemy, while providing the defensive advantage that had served English armies well from Hastings to Agincourt. The royal standard flew proudly above the ranks, the white boar of Richard gleaming against silk that rippled in the morning breeze. Around the king gathered the flower of Yorkshire nobility, men whose fathers and grandfathers had died for the White Rose, whose loyalty to the House of York ran deeper than personal affection or political calculation. Below, in the marshy ground, beside the Roman road, Henry Tudor's army seemed pitifully small against the royal host. Yet the red dragon banner that marked his position carried with it the hopes of all who had grown weary of Richard's rule. Welsh longbowmen, their skill inherited from ancestors who had served the Black Prince, stood beside French mercenaries whose professional competence offset their lack of emotional investment in the English succession. English exiles, men who had followed Henry through years of poverty and uncertainty, gripped their weapons with the desperate determination of those who knew that defeat meant death or perpetual banishment. Between the armies, The Stanleys waited with their substantial forces, their banners flying, but their intentions as murky as the morning mist that clung to the valley floor. Lord Thomas Stanley, Henry's stepfather, and his brother Sir William had positioned their men where they could intervene decisively in favour of either side. Their careful neutrality, the kind of political calculation that had kept noble families alive through decades of dynastic warfare. The battle began not with the crash of charging cavalry, but with the methodical advance of infantry formations, men walking steadily toward death or glory across fields where farmers had recently harvested grain. The initial exchanges favoured the royal army, Richard's superior numbers, and position telling against Henry's smaller force. Yet the Tudor claimants' commanders fought with the skill of men who had learned warfare in the harsh school of continental battlefields. As the morning wore on, the crucial moment approached, the moment when the Stanleys would reveal their true allegiance. Richard, watching from his command position, could see his advantage gradually eroding as casualties mounted, and his numerical superiority failed to translate into decisive victory. The king's messengers rode frantically between the royal position and the Stanley forces, demanding the support that could ensure victory, receiving only evasive responses that spoke louder than any words. The decision that would end the medieval age came not from careful calculation, but from the desperate courage of a king who saw his throne slipping away with each passing hour. Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, chose to stake everything on a single, decisive charge directly at Henry Tudor's position, leading his household knights in a cavalry attack that would either end the battle in minutes or end his reign forever. The charge began magnificently, the king's destrier pounding across the battlefield, while the white boar banner streamed behind him like a battle cry made visible. Richard fought through the enemy ranks with the fury of a man defending not just his crown, but his honour, his sword cutting down Henry's standard-bearer, bringing him within striking distance of the Tudor claimant himself. For a moment, that seemed suspended between heaven and earth. The fate of England hung on the skill of two men fighting hand-to-hand in the mud of a Leicestershire field. Yet even as Richard's courage blazed brightest, the Stanley forces finally revealed their true allegiance, Sir William's men charging into the royal flank with devastating effect. The king found himself surrounded, his household knights falling around him like wheat before the scythe, his own strength ebbing as wounds accumulated on his slight frame. Still he fought, refusing surrender, choosing death as a king over life, as a prisoner. The moment of Richard's death marked more than the end of a king. It marked the end of an entire conception of kingship that had dominated England since the Norman Conquest. The medieval ideal of personal monarchy, where the king's physical prowess and divine sanction were inseparable, died with Richard III in the mud of Bosworth Field. The crown that rolled from his battered head into a thorn bush symbolised the passing of an age where kings led from the front, where royal authority derived from the ability to inspire men to follow unto death. Lord Stanley's retrieval of the crown and its placement on Henry Tudor's head transformed a successful rebel into Henry VII, King of England. Yet the ceremony carried none of the traditional sanctity that usually surrounded such moments. The new king stood not in Westminster Abbey surrounded by bishops and ancient ritual, but on a battlefield among the dead and dying, his crown won not through hereditary right or divine appointment, but through successful warfare and political alliance. The battle's aftermath revealed the complexity of loyalties that had shaped the conflict, as men who had served Richard faithfully were pardoned and incorporated into the new regime, while others who had wavered in their support found themselves excluded from royal favour. Henry's victory had been narrow enough that he could afford neither widespread executions nor wholesale changes in administrative personnel, his survival depending on his ability to reconcile former enemies while rewarding faithful friends. As news of Bosworth spread across England, the realm's response revealed the war weariness that had made Henry's victory possible. There were no great uprisings in Richard's name, no passionate demonstrations of loyalty to the fallen king. Instead, England accepted the Tudor victory with the resignation of a people exhausted by 30 years of dynastic conflict, ready to embrace any king who could promise stable government and an end to civil war. The body of Richard III, stripped and slung naked across a pack horse for the journey to Leicester, represented the final humiliation of medieval kingship's claims to sacred authority. The king, who had been anointed with holy oils, whose touch was believed to cure disease, whose person was held to be inviolate, was treated in death like any common soldier fallen in battle. The casual brutality of his treatment reflected not personal animosity, but the practical necessities of establishing a new dynasty on the ruins of the old. Henry VII's entry into London on September 3rd, 1485, lacked the triumphant pageantry that had marked the arrivals of previous conquerors, yet it carried within it the promise of transformation that would reshape England more profoundly than any military victory. The new king rode not as a warrior returning from battle, but as an administrator taking possession of an enterprise that required careful management rather than heroic gestures. The coronation on October 30th restored the sacred rituals that legitimized royal authority, yet even this ancient ceremony carried innovations that reflected the changing nature of kingship. Henry's marriage to Elizabeth of York in January 1486 fulfilled his promise to unite the warring roses. Yet the union represented more than dynastic reconciliation. It symbolized the emergence of a new kind of monarchy that derived its strength from popular consent rather than military prowess. The early years of Henry's reign demonstrated his understanding that survival depended on establishing governmental institutions that could function regardless of the king's personal qualities. The revival of the Court of Star Chamber, the systematization of royal finances, the careful cultivation of merchant interests that would provide reliable sources of revenue, all reflected a vision of monarchy as administrative efficiency, rather than personal dominance. The birth of Prince Arthur in September 1486, 9 months after the royal wedding, provided the dynasty with its essential heir, while simultaneously demonstrating Henry's political sophistication. The choice of Arthur as the prince's name invoked the legendary British king whose return had been prophesied for centuries, suggesting that the Tudors represented not foreign conquest, but native restoration. The return of authentic English kingship after centuries of Norman and Plantagenet rule. Yet even as Henry consolidated his position through careful policy and dynastic marriages, the ghosts of the medieval past continued to haunt his reign. The appearance of Lambert Simnel in 1487, claiming to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, demonstrated that the legitimacy questions that had plagued Richard III's reign remained unresolved. The Irish support for Simnel's claim, culminating in his coronation in Dublin as Edward VI, revealed how easily the established order could be challenged by anyone willing to exploit the uncertainties surrounding the Yorkist succession. The Battle of Stokefield on June 16, 1487, proved to be the true end of the Wars of the Roses, the final military challenge to Tudor rule, defeated not through overwhelming force, but through the professional competence of a king who understood that successful warfare required careful planning rather than personal heroics. Henry's decision to pardon Simnel and employ him in the royal kitchens demonstrated a new approach to defeated enemies. Pragmatic mercy replacing the cycle of execution and revenge that had characterized previous dynastic conflicts. The emergence of Perkin Warbeck in the 1490s, claiming to be Richard of York, the younger of the princes who had disappeared in the Tower, represented an even more serious challenge to Tudor legitimacy. Warbeck's support from foreign courts, his recognition by Margaret of Burgundy as her nephew, his ability to maintain his deception for nearly a decade, all demonstrated the continuing power of the Yorkist claim and the fragility of Henry's position. Yet, Henry's response to the Warbeck threat revealed the evolution of royal authority from personal combat to institutional strength. Rather than meeting Warbeck in battle, the king employed diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and patient investigation to undermine his rival's support. The eventual capture and execution of Warbeck in 1499 marked not a military victory, but a triumph of administrative persistence over romantic adventure. The execution of Edward, Earl of Warwick, in the same year as Warbeck's death, eliminated the last male Plantagenet with a clear claim to the throne. yet it also demonstrated the moral compromises that the new monarchy required. Warwick's only crime had been his birth, his existence a standing reproach to Tudor legitimacy, yet his death was politically necessary for the security of the dynasty. The contrast between medieval concepts of honour, which would have required fair combat, and Tudor pragmatism, which demanded the elimination of threats regardless of their innocence, marked another stage in the transformation of English kingship. As the 15th century drew to its close, England under Henry VII had achieved the stability that had eluded the realm for decades, yet at a cost that would have been incomprehensible to earlier generations. The king who emerged from the Tudor Revolution was no longer the heroic figure of medieval romance, leading his knights in glorious battle, but a careful administrator managing a complex governmental machine. The crown that Henry wore carried with it not the mystical authority of divine appointment, but the practical responsibility of efficient governance. The marriage of Prince Arthur to Catherine of Aragon in 1501 seemed to crown Henry's achievement, allying England with the most powerful monarchy in Europe while securing the Tudor succession through a union blessed by both dynastic advantage and romantic affection. Yet Arthur's death in April 1502, less than 5 months after his wedding, revealed the fragility that still haunted royal plans, the reminder that death could undo in moments what careful policy had built over years. The emergence of Henry, Duke of York, as heir to the throne after his brother's death, brought to prominence a prince whose personality seemed to embody a return to the medieval ideals that his father had carefully abandoned. Young Henry's love of tournaments and martial display, his magnificent physical presence and charismatic personality, his easy familiarity with the great nobles of the realm, all suggested that the next reign might see a revival of the personal monarchy that had died with Richard III at Bosworth Field. Yet even as the young prince prepared for his future role, the foundations that his father had laid continued to strengthen, the governmental institutions and administrative practices that would enable the Tudor dynasty to survive the challenges that would face it in the coming century. The England that Henry VII bequeathed to his son was no longer the medieval kingdom that had torn itself apart in the Wars of the Roses, but a modern state capable of competing with the great powers of Renaissance Europe. The death of Henry VII on April 21st, 1509, marked the end of the First Tudor reign and the completion of England's transformation from medieval to modern monarchy. The king who died at Richmond Palace had never worn armour in battle, had never led a cavalry charge or challenged an enemy to single combat, yet his reign had achieved more than any of the warrior kings who had preceded him. Through careful policy rather than martial glory, through administrative efficiency rather than personal charisma, Henry VII had established a dynasty that would rule England for over a century. And so the great wheel of medieval England turned one final time, carrying away the world of knights and castles, of feudal bonds and sacred oaths, of crusades and chivalry that had defined the English experience for over 4 centuries. The crown that had passed from Norman to Plantagenet, from Angevin to Yorkist, now rested upon Tudor heads. Yet it was no longer the same crown that William the Conqueror had worn at Westminster in 1066. The realm itself remained, its fields still, green beneath English skies, its people still bound by ties of blood and memory to the soil their ancestors had worked for generations beyond counting. Yet the England that emerged from the medieval centuries was transformed beyond recognition, its castles becoming palaces, its knights becoming courtiers, its feudal lords becoming servants of a crown that drew its authority not from divine appointment, but from popular consent. In the silence that settled over Bosworth Field after the last sword was sheathed and the final banner furled, a new world was born from the ashes of the old. The medieval age that had begun with the thunder of Norman hooves on English soil ended, with the whispered prayers of a Welsh prince kneeling to receive a crown that would carry England into the Renaissance and beyond. The stones of ancient castles still stand sentinel over valleys where medieval armies once marched, their walls remembering the voices of kings whose names echo through the centuries like distant thunder. The cathedrals still lift their spires toward heaven, their arches framing prayers that have risen from English lips for nearly 1,000 years. The very landscape bears the marks of medieval hands. The field boundaries and village greens, the church towers and market squares that speak of an age when life moved to rhythms older than memory. Yet beneath the surface of continuity, everything had changed. The world that Henry VIII would inherit was no longer the world that his medieval predecessors had known. No longer the realm where kings ruled by the strength of their sword arms and the sanctity of their anointing. The Tudor crown rested upon foundations of administrative efficiency and parliamentary consent, its authority derived from practical success rather than mystical appointment. The story of medieval England draws to its close not with the crash of falling towers or the lament of dispossessed nobles, but with the quiet transition from one age to another, the gradual transformation of a realm that had learned to value peace above glory, prosperity above honour, stability above the wild romanticism that had characterized the medieval centuries. In the end, medieval England died not in battle, but in bed, not through violent conquest, but through peaceful evolution, not with the dramatic flourish that marked the death of Richard III, but with the administrative competence that characterized the reign of Henry VII. The last medieval king fell at Bosworth with his sword in his hand and the crown upon his head, while the first modern king rose from the same battlefield with calculated pragmatism and a vision of monarchy that would endure for centuries. And in the twilight between the medieval and the modern, in the space between the death of one world and the birth of another, England found its soul transformed yet eternal, its destiny bound to the memory of all that had been and the promise of all that was yet to come. The medieval centuries passed into history, yet their echo remains in every stone of every ancient church, in every line of every charter, in every memory of every heart that has ever felt the pull of England's ancient glory and enduring hope. Thank you for joining us on this journey through medieval England. If these stories from history have touched your heart and helped you find peace, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share these timeless tales with others who might find comfort in the whispered voices of the past. Let us know in the comments which period of history you'd like to explore next as you fall asleep to the gentle rhythm of ancient stories. Your support helps us continue bringing these forgotten worlds back to life, one peaceful night at a time. Sweet dreams, and may history's gentle voices guide you to restful sleep.